Preface from the New Organon by Francis Bacon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Organon, or True Directions Concerning the Interpretation of Nature. Francis Bacon, 1620, Author's Preface. Those who have taken upon them to lay down the law of nature as a thing already searched out and understood, whether they have spoken in simple assurance or professional affectation, have therein done philosophy and the sciences great injury. For as they have been successful in inducing belief, so they have been effective in quenching and stopping inquiry, and have done more harm by spoiling and putting an end to other men's efforts than good by their own. Those, on the other hand, who have taken a contrary course, and asserted that absolutely nothing can be known, whether it were from hatred of the ancient sophists, or from uncertainty and fluctuation of mind, or even from a kind of fullness of learning, that they fell upon this opinion, have certainly advanced reasons for it that are not to be despised, but yet they have neither started from true principles, nor rested in the just conclusion, zeal and affectation having carried them much too far. The more ancient of the Greeks, whose writings are lost, took up with better judgment a position between these two extremes, between the presumption of pronouncing on everything and the despair of comprehending anything. And though frequently and bitterly complaining of the difficulty of inquiry and the obscurity of things, and like impatient horses champing at the bit, they did not the less follow up their object and engage with nature, thinking, it seems, that this very question, that is, whether or not anything can be known, was to be settled not by arguing, but by trying. And yet they, too, trusting entirely to the force of their understanding, applied no rule, but made everything turn upon hard thinking and perpetual working and exercise of the mind. Now my method, though hard to practice, is easy to explain, and it is this. I propose to establish progressive stages of certainty. The evidence of the sense, helped and guarded by a certain process of correction, I retain. But the mental operation which follows the act of sense I for the most part reject, and instead of it I open and lay out a new and certain path for the mind to proceed in, starting directly from the simple sensuous perception. The necessity of this was felt, no doubt, by those who attributed so much importance to logic, showing thereby that they were in search of helps for the understanding and had no confidence in the native and spontaneous process of the mind. But this remedy comes too late to do any good, when the mind is already, through the daily intercourse and conversation of life, occupied with unsound doctrines and beset on all sides by vain imaginations. And therefore, that art of logic, coming, as I said, too late to the rescue, and no way able to set matters right again, has had the effect of fixing errors rather than disclosing truth. There remains but one course for the recovery of a sound and healthy condition, namely, that the entire work of the understanding be commenced afresh, and the mind itself be from the very onset not left to take its own course, but guided at every step, and the business be done as if by machinery. Certainly if in things mechanical men had set to work with their naked hands, without help or force of instruments, just as in things intellectual they have set to work with little else than the naked forces of the understanding, very small would the matters have been which, even with their best efforts applied in conjunction, they could have attempted or accomplished. Now, to pause a while upon this example, and look in it as in a glass, let us suppose that some vast obelisk were, for the decoration of a triumph or some such magnificence, to be removed from its place, and that men should set to work upon it with their naked hands. Would not any sober spectator think them mad? And if they should send for more people, thinking that in that way they might manage it, would he not think them all the madder? And if they then proceeded to make a selection, putting away the weaker hands, and using only the strong and vigorous, would he not think them madder than ever? And if lastly, not content with this, they resolved to call in the aid of an art of athletics, and required all their men to come with hands, arms, and sinews well anointed and medicated according to the rules of the art, would he not cry out that they were only taking pains to show a kind of method and discretion in their madness? Yet just so is it that men proceed in matters intellectual, with just the same kind of mad effort and useless combination of forces, when they hope great things either from the number and cooperation or from the excellency and acuteness of individual wits. Yea, and when they endeavor by logic, which may be considered as a kind of athletic art, to strengthen the sinews of the understanding, and yet with all this study and endeavor it is apparent to any true judgment that they are but applying the naked intellect all the time, whereas in every great work to be done by the hand of man, it is manifestly impossible, without instruments and machinery, either for the strength of each to be exerted, or the strength of all to be united. Upon these premises, two things occur to me of which, that they may not be overlooked, I would have men reminded. First, it falls out fortunately, as I think, for the allaying of contradictions and heartburnings, that the honor and reverence due to the ancients remains untouched and undiminished, while I may carry out my designs, and at the same time reap the fruit of my modesty. For if I should profess that I, going the same road as the ancients, have something better to produce, there must needs have been some comparison or rivalry between us, not to be avoided by any art of words, in respect of excellency or ability of wit, and though in this there would be nothing unlawful or new, for if there be anything misapprehended by them, or falsely laid down, why may not I, using liberty common to all, take exception to it? Yet the contest, however just and allowable, would have been an unequal one perhaps, in respect of the measure of my own powers. As it is, however, my object being to open a new way for the understanding, a way by them untried and unknown, the case is altered. Party zeal and emulation are at an end, and I appear merely as a guide to point out the road, an office of small authority, and depending more upon a kind of luck than upon any ability or excellency. And this much relates to the persons only. The other point of which I would have men reminded relates to the matter itself. Be it remembered, then, that I am far from wishing to interfere with the philosophy which now flourishes, or with any other philosophy more correct and complete than this which has been, or may hereafter be propounded. For I do not object to the use of this received philosophies, or others like it, for supplying the matter for disputations or ornaments for discourse, for the professor's lecture, and for the business of life. Nay, more, I declare openly that for these uses the philosophy which I bring forward will not be much available. It does not lie in the way. It cannot be caught up in passage. It does not flatter the understanding by conformity with preconceived notions, nor will it come down to the apprehensions of the vulgar except by its utility and effects. Let there be therefore, and may it be for the benefit of both, two streams and two dispensations of knowledge, and in like manner two tribes or kindreds of students in philosophy, tribes not hostile or alien to each other, but bound together by mutual services. Let there, in short, be one method for the cultivation, another for the invention of knowledge, and for those who prefer the former, either from hurry or for considerations of business or for want of mental power to take in and embrace the other, which must needs be most men's case, I wish that they may succeed to their desire in what they are about, and obtain what they are pursuing. But if there be any man who, not content to rest in and use the knowledge which has already been discovered, aspires to penetrate further, to overcome, not an adversary in argument, but nature in action, to seek, not pretty and probable conjectures, but certain and demonstrable knowledge, I invite all such to join themselves, as true sons of knowledge with me, that passing by the outer courts of nature, which numbers have trodden, we may find a way at length into her inner chambers. And to make my meaning clearer, and to familiarize the thing by giving it a name, I have chosen to call one of these methods or ways anticipation of the mind, the other interpretation of nature. Moreover, I have one request to make. I have on my own part made it by my care and study that the things which I shall propound should not only be true, but should also be presented to men's minds, how strangely soever preoccupied and obstructed, in a manner not harsh or unpleasant. It is but reasonable, however, especially in so great a restoration of learning and knowledge, that I should claim of men one favor in return, which is this. If anyone would form an opinion or judgment either out of his own observation, or out of the crowd of authorities, or out of the forms of demonstration, which have now acquired a sanction like that of judicial laws, concerning these speculations of mine, let him not hope that he can do it in passage or by the by, but let him examine the thing thoroughly. Let him make some little trial for himself of the way which I describe and lay out. Let him familiarize his thoughts with that subtlety of nature to which experience bears witness. Let him correct by seasonable patience and due delay the depraved and deep-rooted habits of his mind. And when all this is done, and he has begun to be his own master, let him, if he will, use his own judgment. End of Author's Preface to the New Organon, Francis Bacon, 1620. Read by M.L. Cohen, MojoMove411.com, Cleveland, Ohio, September 2007.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
Death's Duel by Donne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Ringeth. Death's Duel, or A Consolation to the Soul Against the Dying Life and Living Death of the Body. Delivered in a sermon at Whitehall, before the King's Majesty, in the beginning of Lent, 1630, being his last sermon, and called by his Majesty's household the Doctor's own funeral sermon. To the reader. This sermon was, by sacred authority, styled the author's own funeral sermon, most fitly, whether we respect the time or matter. It was preached not many days before his death, as if, having done this, there remained nothing for him to do but to die. And the matter is of death, the occasion and subject of all funeral sermons. It hath been observed of this reverend man, that his faculty in preaching continually increased, and that as he exceeded others at first, so at last he exceeded himself. This is his last sermon. I will not say it is therefore his best, because all his were excellent. Yet thus much. A dying man's words, if they concern ourselves, do usually make the deepest impression, as being spoken most feelingly and with least affectation. Now, whom doth it concern to learn both the danger and benefit of death? Death is every man's enemy, and intends hurt to all, though to many he be occasion of greatest good. This enemy we must all combat dying, whom he living did almost conquer, having discovered the utmost of his power, the utmost of his cruelty. May we make such use of this, and other the like preparatives, that neither death, whensoever it shall come, may seem terrible, nor life tedious, how long soever it shall last. Death's Duel. Psalm 68, verse 20, in fine. And unto God the Lord belong the issues of death, i.e., from death. Buildings stand by the benefit of their foundations that sustain and support them, and of their buttresses that comprehend and embrace them, and of their contignations that knit and unite them. The foundations suffer them not to sink, the buttresses suffer them not to swerve, and the contignation and knitting suffers them not to cleave. The body of our building is in the former part of this verse. It is this: He that is our God is the God of salvation. Ad salutes, of salvations in the plural, so it is in the original. The God that gives us spiritual and temporal salvation too. But of this building, the foundation, the buttresses, the contignations, are in this part of the verse which constitutes our text, and in the three diverse acceptations of the word amongst our expositors. Unto God the Lord belong the issues from death. For first, the foundation of this building, that our God is the God of all salvation, is laid in this, that unto this God the Lord belong the issues of death. That is, it is in his power to give us an issue and deliverance, even then when we are brought to the jaws and teeth of death, and to the lips of that whirlpool, the grave. And so in this acceptation, this exitus mortis, this issue of death, is liberatio a morte, a deliverance from death. And this is the most obvious and most ordinary acceptation of these words, and that upon which our translation lays hold, the issues from death. And then secondly, the buttresses that comprehend and settle this building, that he that is our God is the God of all salvation, are thus raised. Unto God the Lord belong the issues of death. That is, the disposition and manner of our death. What kind of issue and transmigration we shall have out of this world, whether prepared or sudden, whether violent or natural, whether in our perfect senses or shaken and disordered by sickness. There is no condemnation to be argued out of that, no judgment to be made upon that. For howsoever they die, precious in his sight is the death of his saints, and with him are the issues of death. The ways of our departing out of this life are in his hands. And so in this sense of the words, this exitus mortis, the issues of death, is liberatio in morte, a deliverance in death. Not that God will deliver us from dying, but that he will have a care of us in the hour of death, of what kind soever our passage be. And in this sense and acceptation of the words, the natural frame and contexture doth well and pregnantly administer unto us. And then, lastly, the contignation and knitting of this building, that he that is our God is the God of all salvations, consists in this: Unto this God the Lord belong the issues of death. That is, that this God the Lord, having united and knit both natures in one, and being God, having also come into this world in our flesh, he could have no other means to save us. He could have no other issue out of this world, nor return to his former glory, but by death. And so in this sense, this exitus mortis, this issue of death, is liberatio per mortem, a deliverance by death, by the death of this God, our Lord Christ Jesus. And this is St. Augustine's acceptation of the words, and those many and great persons that have adhered to him. In all these three lines, then, we shall look upon these words. First, as the God of power, the Almighty Father rescues his servants from the jaws of death. And then, as the God of mercy, the glorious Son rescued us by taking upon himself this issue of death. And then, between these two, as the God of comfort, the Holy Ghost rescues us from all discomfort by his blessed impressions beforehand, that what manner of death soever be ordained for us, yet this exitus mortis shall be introitus in vitam. Our issue in death shall be an entrance into everlasting life. And these three considerations, our deliverance a morte, in morte, per mortem, from death, in death, and by death, will abundantly do all the offices of the foundations, of the buttresses, of the contignation of this our building, that he that is our God is the God of all salvation, because unto this God the Lord belong the issues of death. First then, we consider this exitus mortis to be liberatio a morte, that with God the Lord are the issues of death, and therefore in all our death and deadly calamities in this life, we may justly hope of a good issue from him. In all our periods and transitions in this life are so many passages from death to death. Our very birth and entrance into this life is exitus a morte, an issue from death. For in our mother's womb we are dead, so as that we do not know we live, not so much as we do in our sleep. Neither is there any grave so close or so putrid a prison, as the womb would be unto us if we stayed in it beyond our time, or died there before our time. In the grave the worms do not kill us. We breed and feed, and then kill those worms which we ourselves produced. In the womb, the dead child kills the mother that conceived it, and is a murderer, nay, a parricide, even after it is dead. And if we be not dead so in the womb, so as that being dead we kill her that gave us our first life, our life of vegetation, yet we are dead so as David's idols are dead. In the womb we have eyes and see not, ears and hear not. There in the womb we are fitted for works of darkness, all the while deprived of light. And there in the womb we are taught cruelty, being fed with blood, and may be damned though we be never born. Of our very making in the womb, David says, I am wonderfully and fearfully made, and such knowledge is too excellent for me. For even that is the Lord's doing, and it is wonderful in our eyes. Ipse fecit nos. It is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves, nor our parents neither. Thy hands have made me, and fashioned me round about, saith Job. And, as the original word is, thou hast taken pains about me. And yet, says he, thou dost destroy me. Though I be the masterpiece of the greatest master, man is so. Yet if thou do no more for me, if thou leave me where thou madest me, destruction will follow. The womb, which should be the house of life, becomes death itself if God leave us there. That which God threatens so often, the shutting of a womb, is not so heavy nor so discomfortable a curse in the first as in the latter shutting, nor in the shutting of barrenness as in the shutting of weakness, when children are come to the birth, and no strength to bring forth. It is the exaltation of misery to fall from a near hope of happiness, and in that vehement imprecation the prophet expresses the highest of God's anger. Give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give them? Give them a miscarrying womb. Therefore, as soon as we are men, that is, inanimated, quickened in the womb, though we cannot ourselves, our parents have to say in our behalf, Wretched man that he is, who shall deliver him from this body of death, if there be no deliverer? It must be he that said to Jeremiah, Before I formed thee I knew thee, and before thou camest out of the womb I sanctified thee. We are not sure that there was no kind of ship nor boat to fish in nor to pass by, till God prescribed Noah that absolute form of the ark. That word which the Holy Ghost by Moses useth for the ark is common to all kinds of boats, theba, and is the same word that Moses useth for the boat that he was exposed in, that his mother laid him in an ark of bulrushes. But we are sure that Eve had no midwife when she was delivered of Cain. Therefore she might well say, Posedi virum ad Domino, I have gotten a man from the Lord, wholly, entirely from the Lord. It is the Lord that enabled me to conceive, the Lord that infused a quickening soul into that conception, the Lord that brought into the world that which himself had quickened. Without all this might Eve say, my body had been but the house of death, and Domini Domini sunt exitus mortis. To God the Lord belong the issues of death. But then, this exitus a morte is but introitus in mortem. This issue, this deliverance from that death, the death of the womb, is an entrance, a delivering over to another death, the manifold deaths of this world. We have a winding sheet in our mother's womb, which grows with us from our conception, and we come into the world wound up in that winding sheet, for we come to seek a grave. And as prisoners discharged of actions may lie for fees, so when the womb hath discharged us, yet we are bound to it by cords of hesti, by such a string as that we cannot go thence nor stay there. We celebrate our own funerals with cries even at our birth, as though our 70 years' life were spent in our mother's labor, and our circle made up in the first point thereof. We beg our baptism with another sacrament. with tears, and we come into a world that lasts many ages, but we last not. In Domo Patris, says our Saviour, speaking of heaven, multae mansiones, diverse and durable. So that if a man cannot possess a martyr's house, he hath shed no blood for Christ, yet he may have a confessor's, he hath been ready to glorify God in the shedding of his blood. And if a woman cannot possess a virgin's house, she hath embraced the holy state of marriage, yet she may have a matron's house, she hath brought forth and brought up children in the fear of God. In Domo Patris, in my Father's house, in heaven, there are many mansions. But here, upon earth, the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head, saith he himself. Nonne terram dedit filiis hominum. How then hath God given this earth to the sons of men? He hath given them earth for their materials, to be made of earth, and he hath given them earth for their grave and sepulchre, to return and resolve to earth, but not for their possession. Here we have no continuing city, nay, no cottage that continues, nay, no persons, no bodies that continue. Whatsoever moved St. Jerome to call the journeys of the Israelites in the wilderness mansions, the word is nasang, signifies but a journey, but a peregrination. Even the Israel of God hath no mansions, but journeys, pilgrimages in this life. By what measure did Jacob measure his life to Pharaoh? The days of the years of my pilgrimage. And though the apostle would not say morimer, that whilst we are in the body we are dead, yet he says peregrinamer. Whilst we are in the body we are but in a pilgrimage, and we are absent from the Lord. He might have said dead, for this whole world is but an universal churchyard, but our common grave, and the life and motion that the greatest persons have in it is but as the shaking of buried bodies in their grave by an earthquake. That which we call life is but hebdomadum mortium, a week of death. 7 days, 7 periods of our life spent in dying, a dying 7 times over, and there is an end. Our birth dies in infancy, and our infancy dies in youth, and youth and the rest die in age, and age also dies and determines all. Nor do all these, youth out of infancy, or age out of youth, arise so as the phoenix out of the ashes of another phoenix formerly dead, but as a wasp, or a serpent out of a carrion, or as a snake out of dung. Our youth is worse than our infancy, and our age worse than our youth. Our youth is hungry and thirsty after those sins which our infancy knew not, and our age is sorry and angry that it cannot pursue those sins which our youth did. And besides, all the way, so many deaths, that is, so many deadly calamities accompany every condition and every period of this life, as that death itself would be an ease to them that suffer them. Upon this sense doth Job wish that God had not given him an issue from the first death, from the womb. Wherefore hast thou brought me forth out of the womb? Oh, that I had given up the ghost and no eye seen me! I should have been as though I had not been. And not only the impatient Israelites in their murmuring, would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, but Elijah himself, when he fled from Jezebel, and went for his life, as that text says, under the juniper tree, requested that he might die, and said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life. So Jonah justifies his impatience, nay, his anger towards God himself. Now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better to die than to live. And when God asked him, Dost thou well to be angry for this? He replies, I do well to be angry, even unto death. How much worse a death than death is this life, which so good men would so often change for death. But if my case be as St. Paul's case, quota die morior, that I die daily, that something heavier than death fall upon me every day. If my case be David's case, tota die mortificamur, all the day long we are killed, that not only every day, but every hour of the day, something heavier than death fall upon me. Though that be true of me, conceptus impeccatus, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me, there I died one death. Though that be true of me, natus filius irae, I was born not only the child of sin, but the child of the wrath of God for sin, which is a heavier death. Yet Domini sunt exitus mortis. With God the Lord are the issues of death. And after a Job, and a Joseph, and a Jeremiah, and a Daniel, I cannot doubt of a deliverance. And if no other deliverance conduce more to his glory and my good, yet he hath the keys of death, and he can let me out at that door. That is, deliver me from the manifold deaths of this world, the omni die and the tota die, the every day's death and every hour's death, by that one death, the final dissolution of body and soul, the end of all. But then, is that the end of all? Is that dissolution of body and soul the last death that the body shall suffer? For of spiritual death we speak not now. It is not. Though this be exitus a morte, it is introitus in mortem. Though it be an issue from manifold deaths of this world, yet it is an entrance into the death of corruption and putrefaction, and vermiculation and incineration, and dispersion in and from the grave, in which every dead man dies over again. It was a prerogative peculiar to Christ, not to die this death, not to see corruption. What gave him this privilege? Not Joseph's great proportion of gums and spices, that might have preserved his body from corruption and incineration longer than he needed it, longer than 3 days, but it would not have done it forever. What preserved him, then? Did his exemption and freedom from original sin preserve him from this corruption and incineration? It is true that original sin hath induced this corruption and incineration upon us. If we had not sinned in Adam, mortality had not put on immortality, as the apostle speaks, nor corruption had not put on incorruption, but we had had our transmigration from this to the other world without any mortality, any corruption at all. But yet, since Christ took sin upon him, so far as made him mortal, he had it so far too, as might have made him see this corruption and incineration, though he had no original sin in himself. What preserved him then? Did the hypostatical union of both natures, God and man, preserve him from this corruption and incineration? It is true that this was a most powerful embalming, to be embalmed with the divine nature itself, to be embalmed with eternity, was able to preserve him from corruption and incineration forever. And he was embalmed so, embalmed with the divine nature itself, even in his body as well as in his soul. For the Godhead, the divine nature, did not depart, but remained still united to his dead body in the grave. But yet, for all this powerful embalming, his hypostatical union of both natures, we see Christ did die, and for all his union which made him God and man, he became no man, for the union of the body and soul makes the man, and he whose soul and body are separated by death, as long as that state lasts, is properly no man. And therefore, as in him the dissolution of body and soul was no dissolution of the hypostatical union, so there is nothing that constrains us to say that though the flesh of Christ had seen corruption and incineration in the grave, this had not been any dissolution of the hypostatical union, for the divine nature, the Godhead, might have remained with all the elements and principles of Christ's body, as well as it did with the two constitutive parts of his person, his body and his soul. This incorruption, then, was not in Joseph's gums and spices, nor was it in Christ's innocency and exemption from original sin, nor was it, that is, it is not necessary to say it was, in the hypostatical union. But this incorruptibleness of his flesh is most conveniently placed in that, non dabis, thou wilt not suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. We look no further for causes or reasons in the mysteries of religion, but to the will and pleasure of God. Christ himself limited his inquisition in that ita est, even so, Father, for so it seemeth good in thy sight. Christ's body did not see corruption, therefore, because God had decreed it should not. The humble soul, and only the humble soul is the religious soul, rests himself upon God's purposes, and the decrees of God which he hath declared and manifested, not such as are conceived and imagined in ourselves, though upon some probability, some verisimilitude. So, in our present case, Peter proceeds in his sermon at Jerusalem, and so Paul in his at Antioch. They preached Christ to have been risen without seeing corruption, not only because God had decreed it, but because he had manifested that decree in his prophet. Therefore doth St. Paul cite by special number the 2nd Psalm for that decree, and therefore both St. Peter and St. Paul cite for it that place in the 16th Psalm. For when God declares his decree and purpose in the express words of his prophet, or when he declares it in the real execution of the decree, then he makes it ours, then he manifests it to us. And therefore, as the mysteries of our religion are not the objects of our reason, but by faith we rest on God's decree and purpose, it is so, O God, because it is thy will it should be so. So God's decrees are ever to be considered in the manifestation thereof. All manifestation is either in the word of God or in the execution of the decree. And when these two concur and meet, it is the strongest demonstration that can be. When therefore I find those marks of adoption and spiritual filiation which are delivered in the word of God to be upon me, when I find that real execution of his good purpose upon me, as that actually I do live under the obedience and under the conditions which are evidences of adoption and spiritual filiation, then, so long as I see these marks and live so, I may safely comfort myself in a holy certitude and a modest infallibility of my adoption. Christ determines himself in that the purpose of God was manifest to him. St. Peter and St. Paul determine themselves in those two ways of knowing the purpose of God, the word of God before the execution of the decree in the fullness of time. It was prophesied before, said they, and it is performed now. Christ is risen without seeing corruption. Now, this which is so singularly peculiar to him, that his flesh should not see corruption, at his second coming, his coming to judgment, shall extend to all that are then alive. Their hesti shall not see corruption, because, as the apostle says, and says as a secret, as a mystery, behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. That is, not continue in the state of the dead in the grave, but we shall all be changed in an instant. We shall have a dissolution, and in the same instant a redintegration, a recompacting of body and soul, and that shall be truly a death and truly a resurrection, but no sleeping in corruption. But for us that die now, and sleep in the state of the dead, we must all pass this posthumous death, this death after death, nay, this death after burial, this dissolution after dissolution, this death of corruption and putrefaction, of vermiculation and incineration, of dissolution and dispersion in and from the grave, when these bodies that have been the children of royal parents and the parents of royal children must say with Job, Corruption, thou art my father, and to the worm, thou art my mother and my sister. Miserable riddle, when the same worm must be my mother and my sister and myself. Miserable incest, when I must be married to my mother and my sister, and be both father and mother to my own mother and sister, beget and bear that worm which is all that miserable penury. When my mouth shall be filled with dust, and the worm shall feed and feed sweetly upon me. When the ambitious man shall have no satisfaction, if the poorest alive tread upon him, nor the poorest receive any contentment in being made equal to princes, for they shall be equal but in dust. One dieth at his full strength, being wholly at ease and in quiet. and another dies in the bitterness of his soul, and never eats with pleasure. But they lie down alike in the dust, and the worm covers them. In Job and in Isaiah it covers them, and is spread under them. The worm is spread under thee, and the worm covers thee. There are the mats and the carpets that lie under, and there are the state and the canopy that hang over, the greatest of the sons of men. Even those bodies that were the temples of the Holy Ghost come to this dilapidation, to ruin, to rubbish, to dust. Even the Israel of the Lord, and Jacob himself, hath no other specification, no other denomination, but that vermis Jacob, thou worm of Jacob. Truly the consideration of this posthumous death, this death after burial, that after God, with whom are the issues of death, hath delivered me from the death of the womb, by bringing me into this world, and from the manifold deaths of the world, by laying me in the grave, I must die again in an incineration of this flesh, and in a dispersion of that dust. That monarch, who spread over many nations alive, must in his dust lie in a corner of that sheet of lead, and there but so long as that lead will last. And that private and retired man, that thought himself his own forever, and never came forth, must in his dust of the grave be published, and, such are the revolutions of the grave, be mingled with the dust of every highway, and of every dunghill, and swallowed in every puddle and pond. This is the most inglorious and contemptible vilification, the most deadly and peremptory nullification of man that we can consider. God seems to have carried the declaration of his power to a great height when he sets the prophet Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones, and says, Son of man, can these bones live? As though it had been impossible. And yet they did. The Lord laid sinews upon them, and flesh, and breathed into them, and they did live. But in that case, there were bones to be seen, something visible, of which it might be said, Can this thing live? But in this death of incineration and dispersion of dust, we see nothing that we call that man's. If we say, Can this dust live? Perchance it cannot. It may be the mere dust of the earth, which never did live, never shall. It may be the dust of that man's worm, which did live but shall no more. It may be the dust of another man that concerns not him of whom it was asked. This death of incineration and dispersion is, to natural reason, the most irrecoverable death of all. And yet, Domini Domini sunt exitus mortis. Unto God the Lord belong the issues of death. And by recompacting this dust into the same body, and remaining the same body with the same soul, he shall, in a blessed and glorious resurrection, give me such an issue from this death, as shall never pass into any other death, but establish me into a life that shall last as long as the Lord of life himself. And so have you that belongs to the first acceptation of these words. Unto God the Lord belong the issues of death. That though from the womb to the grave, and in the grave itself, we pass from death to death, yet, as Daniel speaks, the Lord our God is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us. And so we pass into our second accommodation of these words. Unto God the Lord belong the issues of death. That it belongs to God, and not to man, to pass a judgment upon us at our death, or to conclude a dereliction on God's part upon the manner thereof. Those indications which the physicians receive, and those presuggestions which they give for death or recovery in the patient, they receive and they give out of the grounds and rules of their art. But we have no such rule or art to give a presuggestion of spiritual death and damnation upon any such indication as we see in any dying man. We see often enough to be sorry, but not to despair. We may be deceived both ways. We used to comfort ourselves in the death of a friend, if it be testified that he went away like a lamb, that is, without any reluctation. But God knows that may be accompanied with a dangerous damp and stupefaction, and insensibility of his present state. Our blessed Saviour suffered colluctations with death, and a sadness even in his soul to death, and an agony even to a bloody sweat in his body, and expostulations with God, and exclamations upon the cross. He was a devout man who said upon his deathbed, or death turf, for he was a hermit, Septuaginta annos Domini servivisti et mori times. Hast thou served a good master 70 years, and now art thou loath to go into his presence? Yet Hilarion was loath. Barlaam was a devout man, a hermit too, that said that day he died, Cogita te hodie caepisse servire Domino et hodie finitorum. Consider this to be the first day's service that ever thou didst to thy master, to glorify him in a Christianly and a constant death. And if thy first day be thy last day too, how soon dost thou come to receive thy wages? Yet Barlaam could have been content to have stayed longer forth. Make no ill conclusions upon any man's loathness to die, for the mercies of God work momentarily in minutes, and many times insensibly to bystanders, or any other than the party departing. And then upon violent deaths, inflicted as upon malefactors, Christ himself hath forbidden us by his own death to make any ill conclusion. For his own death had those impressions in it. He was reputed, he was executed as a malefactor, and no doubt many of them who concurred to his death did believe him to be so. Of sudden death there are scarce examples to be found in the Scriptures upon good men, for death in battle cannot be called sudden death. But God governs not by examples but by rules, and therefore make no ill conclusion upon sudden death, nor upon distempers neither, though perchance accompanied with some words of diffidence and distrust in the mercies of God. The tree lies as it falls, it is true, but it is not the last stroke that fells the tree, nor the last word nor gasp that qualifies the soul. Still pray we for a peaceable life against violent death, and for a time of repentance against sudden death, and for sober and modest assurance against distempered and diffident death, but never make any ill conclusions upon persons overtaken with such death. Domini, Domini sunt exitus mortis. To God the Lord belong the issues of death. And he received Samson, who went out of this world in such a manner, consider it actively, consider it passively, in his own death, and in those whom he slew with himself, as was subject to interpretation hard enough. Yet the Holy Ghost hath moved St. Paul to celebrate Samson in his great catalogue, and so doth all the Church. Our critical day is not the very day of our death, but the whole course of our life. I thank him that prays for me when the bell tolls, but I thank him much more that catechizes me, or preaches to me, or instructs me how to live. Fac hoc et vive. There is my security. The mouth of the Lord hath said it. Do this, and thou shalt live. But though I do it, yet I shall die too. Die a bodily, a natural death. But God never mentions, never seems to consider that death, the bodily, the natural death. God doth not say, live well, and thou shalt die well. That is, an easy, a quiet death. But live well here, and thou shalt live well forever. As the first part of a sentence pieces well with the last, and never respects, never hearkens after the parenthesis that comes between, so doth a good life here flow into an eternal life, without any consideration what so manner of death we die. But whether the gate of my prison be opened with an oiled key, by a gentle and preparing sickness, or the gate be hewn down by a violent death, or the gate be burnt down by a raging and frantic fever, a gate into heaven I shall have, for from the Lord is the cause of my life, and with God the Lord are the issues of death. And further, we carry not this second acceptation of the words, as this issue of death is liberatio in morte, God's care that the soul be safe, what agony soever the body suffers in the hour of death. But pass to our third part, and last part. As this issue of death is liberatio per mortem, a deliverance by the death of another. Sufferantium Job audisti et vidisti finem Domini, says St. James, verse 11. You have heard of the patience of Job, says he. All this while you have done that. For in every man, calamitous, miserable man, a Job speaks. Now, see the end of the Lord, saith that apostle, which is not that end that the Lord proposed to himself, salvation to us, nor the end which he proposes to us, conformity to him. But see the end of the Lord, says he, the end that the Lord himself came to, death, and a painful and a shameful death. But why did he die? And why die so? Quia Domini Domini sunt exitus mortis, as St. Augustine, interpreting this text, answers that question. Because to this God our Lord belonged the issues of death. Quid apertius dicerator, says he there. What can be more obvious, more manifest than this sense of these words? In the former part of this verse it is said, He that is our God is the God of salvation. Deus salvus faciendi, so he reads it, the God that must save us. Who can that be, says he, but Jesus? For therefore that name was given him, because he was to save us. And to this Jesus, says he, this Savior, belong the issues of death. Nec oportuit eam de hac vita alios exitus habere quam mortis. Being come into this life in our mortal nature, he could not go out of this life any other way but by death. Ideo dictum, says he, therefore it is said, to God the Lord belonged the issues of death. Ut ostenderetur moriendo nos salvus facturum, to show us that his way to save us was to die. And from this text doth Saint Isidore prove that Christ was truly man, which as many sects of heretics denied as that he was truly God, because to him, though he were Dominus Dominus, as the text doubles it, God the Lord, yet to him, to God the Lord, belonged the issues of death. Oportuit eam pati, more cannot be said than Christ himself says of himself. These things Christ ought to suffer. He had no other way but death. So then this part of our sermon must needs be a passion sermon, since all his life was a continual passion, all our Lent may be a continual Good Friday. Christ's painful life took off none of the pains of his death. He felt not the less then for having felt so much before. Nor will anything that shall be said before lessen, but rather enlarge the devotion to that which shall be said of his passion at the time of due solemnization thereof. Christ bled not a drop the less at the last for having bled at his circumcision before, nor will you a tear the less than if you shed some now. And therefore be now content to consider with me how to this God the Lord belonged the issues of death. That God, this Lord, the Lord of life, could die is a strange contemplation. That the Red Sea could be dry, that the sun could stand still, that an oven could be 7 times heat and not burn, that lions could be hungry and not bite, is strange, miraculously strange. But super miraculous, that God could die. But that God would die is an exaltation of that. But even of that also, it is a super exaltation, that God should die, must die, and non exitus, said St. Augustine, God the Lord had no issue but by death. And oportuit pati, says Christ himself, all this Christ ought to suffer, was bound to suffer. Deus ultimo Deus, says David, God is the God of revenges. He would not pass over the Son of Man unrevenged, unpunished. But then, Deus ultionum libere egit, says that place. The God of revenges works freely. He punishes, he spares whom he will. And would he not spare himself? He would not. Delectio fortis ut mors. Love is strong as death. Stronger, it drew in death that naturally is not welcome. Si possibile, says Christ, if it be possible, let this cup pass. When his love, expressed in a former decree with his Father, had made it impossible. Many waters quench not love. Christ tried many. He was baptized out of his love, and his love determined not there. He mingled blood with water in his agony, and that determined not his love. He wept pure blood, all his blood at all his eyes, at all his pores, in his flagellations and thorns. To the Lord our God belonged the issues of blood, and these expressed, but these did not quench his love. He would not spare, nay, he could not spare himself. There was nothing more free, more voluntary, more spontaneous than the death of Christ. It is true, libere egit, he died voluntarily. But yet, when we consider the contract that had passed between his Father and him, there was an opportunity, a kind of necessity upon him. All this Christ ought to suffer. And when shall we date this obligation, this opportunity, this necessity? When shall we say that began? Certainly this decree by which Christ was to suffer all this was an eternal decree. And was there anything before that that was eternal? Infinite love. Eternal love. Be pleased to follow this home and to consider it seriously. That what liberty soever we can conceive in Christ, to die or not to die, this necessity of dying, this decree, is as eternal as that liberty. And yet, how small a matter made he of this necessity and this dying. His Father calls it but a bruise, and but a bruising of his heel. The serpent shall bruise his heel. And yet that was, that the serpent should practice and compass his death. Himself calls it but a baptism, as though he were to be the better for it. I have a baptism to be baptized with. And he was in pain till it was accomplished. And yet this baptism was his death. The Holy Ghost calls it joy. For the joy which was set before him he endured the cross, which was not a joy of his reward after his passion, but a joy that filled him even in the midst of his torments, and arose from him. When Christ calls his calicem a cup, and no worse, can ye drink of my cup, he speaks not odiously, not with detestation of it. Indeed, it was a cup, salus mundo, a health to all the world. And quid retribuum, says David. What shall I render to the Lord? Answer you with David. Accipium calicum. I will take the cup of salvation. Take it. That cup is salvation, his passion. If not into your present imitation, yet into your present contemplation. And behold how that Lord that was God, yet could die, would die, must die for our salvation. That Moses and Elias talked with Christ in the Transfiguration, both St. Matthew and St. Mark tells us. But what they talked of, only St. Luke. Dicebant excessum eius, says he. They talked of his disease, of his death, which was to be accomplished at Jerusalem. The word is of his exodus, the very word of our text, exodus, his issue by death. Moses, who in his exodus had prefigured this issue of our Lord, and in passing Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea, had foretold in that actual prophecy Christ's passing of mankind through the sea of his blood. And Elias, whose exodus and issue of this world was a figure of Christ's ascension, had no doubt a great satisfaction in talking with our blessed Lord, de excessu eius, of the full consummation of all this in his death, which was to be accomplished at Jerusalem. Our meditation of his death should be more visceral, and affect us more, because it is of a thing already done. The ancient Romans had a certain tenderness and detestation of the name of death. They could not name death. No, not in their wills. There they could not say, si mori contigerit, but si quid humanitas contigat. Not if or when I die, but when the course of nature is accomplished upon me. To us that speak daily of the death of Christ, he was crucified, dead, and buried, can the memory or the mention of our own death be irksome or bitter? There are in these latter times amongst us that name death freely enough, and the death of God, but in blasphemous oaths and execrations. Miserable men, who shall therefore be said never to have named Jesus, because they have named him too often, and therefore hear Jesus say, Nescivi vos, I never knew you, because they made themselves too familiar with him. Moses and Elias talked with Christ of his death only in a holy and joyful sense, of the benefit which they and all the world were to receive by that. Discourses of religion should not be out of curiosity, but to edification. And then they talked with Christ of his death at that time when he was in the greatest height of glory that ever he admitted in this world, that is, his transfiguration. And we are afraid to speak to the great men of this world of their death, but nourish in them a vain imagination of immortality and immutability. But bonum est nobis esse hic, as St. Peter said there. It is good to dwell here, in this consideration of his death. And therefore transfer we our tabernacle, our devotions, through some of those steps which God the Lord made to his issue of death that day. Taking the whole day, from the hour that Christ received the Passover upon Thursday, unto the hour in which he died the next day. Make this present day that day in thy devotion. And consider what he did, and remember what you have done. Before he instituted and celebrated the sacrament, which was after the eating of the Passover, he proceeded to that act of humility, to wash his disciples' feet, even Peter's, who for a while resisted him. In thy preparation to the holy and blessed sacrament, hast thou with a sincere humility sought a reconciliation with all the world, even from those that have been averse from it, and refused that reconciliation from thee? If so, and not else, thou hast spent this first part of his last day in a conformity with him. After the sacrament, he spent the time till night in prayer, in preaching, in psalms. Hast thou considered that a worthy receiving of the sacrament consists in a continuation of holiness after, as well as in a preparation before? If so, thou hast therein also conformed thyself to him. So Christ spent his time till night. At night, he went into the garden to pray, and he prayed prolixious. He spent much time in prayer. How much? Because it is literally expressed that he prayed there 3 several times, and then returning to his disciples after his first prayer, and finding them asleep, said, Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? It is collected that he spent 3 hours in prayer. I dare scarce ask thee whether thou wentest, or how thou disposedst of thyself when it grew dark and after last night. If that time were spent in a holy recommendation of thyself to God, and a submission of thy will to his, it was spent in a conformity to him. In that time and in those prayers was his agony and bloody sweat. I will hope that thou didst pray, but not every ordinary and customary prayer, but prayer actually accompanied with shedding of tears, and dispositively in a readiness to shed blood for his glory in necessary cases, puts thee into a conformity with him. About midnight he was taken and bound with a kiss. Art thou not too conformable to him in that? Is not that too literally, too exactly thy case, at midnight to have been taken and bound with a kiss? From thence he was carried back to Jerusalem, first to Annas, then to Caiaphas, and, as late as it was, then he was examined and buffered, and delivered over to the custody of those officers from whom he received all those erisions and violences, the covering of his face, the spitting upon his face, the blasphemies of words and the smartness of blows, which that gospel mentions. In which compass fell that Gallicinium, that crowing of the cock which called up Peter to his repentance. How thou passedst all that time, thou knowest. If thou didst anything that needest Peter's tears, and hast not shed them, let me be thy cock. Do it now. Now, thy master, in the unworthiest of his servants, looks back upon thee. Do it now. Betimes, in the morning, so soon as it was day, the Jews held a council in the high priest's hall, and agreed upon their evidence against him, and then carried him to Pilate, who was to be his judge. Didst thou accuse thyself when thou wakedst this morning? And wast thou content even with false accusations? That is, rather to suspect actions to have been sin, which were not, than to smother and justify such as were truly sins? Then thou spentest that hour in conformity to him. Pilate found no evidence against him, and therefore to ease himself, and to pass a compliment upon Herod, Tetrarch of Galilee, who was at that time at Jerusalem, because Christ, being a Galilean, was of Herod's jurisdiction, Pilate set him to Herod, and rather as a madman than a malefactor. Herod remanded him, with scorn, to Pilate, to proceed against him, and this was about 8 of the clock. Hast thou been content to come to this inquisition, this examination, this agitation, this cribration, this pursuit of thy conscience, to sift it, to follow it, from the sins of thy youth to thy present sins, from the sins of thy bed to the sins of thy board, and from the substance to the circumstances of thy sins? That is time spent like thy Saviour's. Pilate would have saved Christ by using the privilege of the day in his behalf, because that day one prisoner was to be delivered. But they chose Barabbas. He would have saved him from death, by satisfying their fury with inflicting other torments upon him, scourging and crowning with thorns, and loading him with many scornful and ignominious contumelies. But they regarded him not. They pressed a crucifying. Hast thou gone about to redeem thy sin, by fasting, by alms, by disciplines and mortifications, in way of satisfaction to the justice of God? That will not serve. That is not the right way. We press an utter crucifying of that sin that governs thee, and that conforms thee to Christ. Towards noon, Pilate gave judgment, and they made such haste to execution as that by noon he was upon the cross. There now hangs that sacred body upon the cross, rebaptized in his own tears and sweat, and embalmed in his own blood alive. There are those bowels of compassion which are so conspicuous, so manifested, as that you may see them through his wounds. There those glorious eyes grew faint in their sight, so as the sun, ashamed to survive them, departed with his light too. And then that Son of God, who was never from us, and yet had now come a new way unto us in assuming our nature, delivers that soul, which was never out of his Father's hands, by a new way, a voluntary admission of it into his Father's hands. For though to this God our Lord belonged these issues of death, so that considered in his own contract he must necessarily die, yet at no breach or battery which they had made upon his sacred body issued his soul, but a misite, he gave up the ghost. And as God breathed a soul into the first Adam, so this second Adam breathed his soul into God, into the hands of God. There we leave you, in that blessed dependency, to hang upon him that hangs upon the cross. There bathe in his tears. There suck at his wounds, and lie down in peace in his grave, till he vouchsafe you a resurrection and an ascension into that kingdom which he hath prepared for you with the inestimable price of his incorruptible blood. Amen. End of Death's Duel. Recording by Adam Ringgoth.
Handcuff releases under difficulties, the remarkable feats of Harry Houdini. From the Scientific American, July 20th, 1912. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Among the well-known vaudeville entertainers must be mentioned Mr. Harry Houdini, whose celebrated feats with handcuffs, straitjackets, and various restraints used to confine the insane and fractious are well known. The public always seems to be interested in seeing the other fellow get away from a tight place, so that it is little wonder that Houdini's audiences are always large. Our attention has recently been attracted to a number of feats which he has been performing in New York and other cities, the culmination of which, perhaps, is the aquatic box trick which we will now describe. On Sunday, July 7th, Mr. Houdini invited a party of newspaper men and those interested in magic to witness a very remarkable box trick on New York Bay. This event was scheduled to take place at a pier on the East River, but owing to police interference, the scene of operations was transferred to the deck of a large lighter which was towed to the dock of the Quartermaster's Department at Governor's Island. As this was federal property, the police could not interfere with this act. A large wooden box, 40 inches long, 22 inches wide, and 24 inches high, was provided. This box was carefully examined, and no indication of panels, bolts, or springs was detected. After divesting himself of his outer clothing, and after a committee had seen that he did not have any concealed keys or devices for picking the locks of the handcuffs, he submitted cheerfully to be manacled with leg irons, 2 pairs of handcuffs, and elbow irons. Any of the spectators had the privilege of bringing their own handcuffs if they so desired, as Houdini does not care about furnishing articles of this kind when he is making his more important tests. The cover of the box was removed, and Houdini crouched in it in a stooped position somewhat resembling the doubling up of a jackknife. The cover was then nailed in place with 36 wire nails, and the entire box was banded with band iron, or, as it is technically known, packed for export. On each side a length of iron sewer pipe was secured and iron sash weights were introduced into the pipe, thus affording a convenient method of weighing down the box so as to cause it to sink to the level of the water. 200 pounds of iron was used. Holes had been bored in it to permit the entrance of the water so that the box itself could be readily submerged. The box was then carefully roped so that no escape from it could have been possible had the nails and band irons been non-existent or have given away. Some of the planks from the lighter were removed, and the box was shoved out on them and was finally dumped in the water. In exactly a minute and 10 seconds Houdini emerged from the water, swimming toward the lifeboat which had been provided. The act was witnessed by thousands of spectators who crowded the decks of 3 ferry boats. The box was hauled onto the deck with the aid of one of the spars of the lighter, and the box was carefully examined. Nothing was found in it except the useless manacles which had failed to bind Houdini under the most adverse conditions. Considering the danger of this feat, and the entire absence of any paraphernalia such as traps, etc., it appears to be all the more wonderful. This may be regarded as one of the most remarkable tricks ever performed, and it is only regrettable that a feat of this magnitude cannot be tried before a larger gathering of spectators. Houdini's box tricks, his milk can trick, and similar entertaining feats will not appeal to the average person as much as his bridge dives, which have taken place in all parts of the world. We are able to show 2 or 3 photographs which give an adequate idea of the remarkable nature of a feat of this kind. In one of the engravings we see Houdini with his hands manacled behind his back and his arms also confined by elbow irons. This photograph was taken just before an 89-foot jump at Sydney, Australia. The next photograph shows the agonized face of Houdini after he struck the water at the wrong angle. Blood flowed from his nose and mouth. This goes to show that the career of the professional strongman, jailbreaker, and handcuff king has not been altogether unfraught with danger. Several of his imitators have tried similar feats with disastrous results, such as broken ribs, and even 2 of them paid the penalty with their lives, being drowned with the manacles still on their wrists. Owing to the uncertainty of an act of this kind, if unsuccessful, it would be almost impossible to rescue and resuscitate a person before he is drowned. A third photograph shows the position of Houdini's body in his famous jump from the Queen's Bridge, Melbourne, Australia, in March 1910. His hands were heavily ironed behind his back with handcuffs, and he succeeded in reaching the surface in a surprisingly short space of time. In this case he was under water about 2 minutes. A gruesome incident occurred at the time of this dive. The shock of Mr. Houdini striking the water was great enough to bring to the surface the body of a man who had been drowned some days before, thus naturally adding greatly to the excitement. We do not pretend to give any explanation of Houdini's performances. We can only say that he states that most of the public exposés of tricks of this kind are absolutely worthless, as they would not work in practice under the severe conditions of a committee of examination. Possibly some of our readers have original solutions of these mysteries. If so, we should be pleased to hear from them. End of Handcuff Releases Under Difficulties, The Remarkable Feats of Harry Houdini. Read by Leanne Howlett.
The Fight for Conservation by Gifford Pinchot. The Moral Issue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fight for Conservation, The Moral Issue. The central thing for which conservation stands is to make this country the best possible place to live in, both for us and our descendants. It stands against the waste of the natural resources which cannot be renewed, such as coal and iron. It stands for the perpetuation of the resources which can be renewed, such as the food-producing soils and the forests. And most of all, it stands for an equal opportunity for every American citizen to get his fair share of benefit from these resources, both now and hereafter. Conservation stands for the same kind of practical common sense management of this country by the people that every businessman stands for in the handling of his own business. It believes in prudence and foresight instead of reckless blindness. It holds that resources now public property should not become the basis for oppressive private monopoly, and it demands the complete and orderly development of all our resources for the benefit of all the people, instead of the partial exploitation of them for the benefit of a few. It recognizes fully the right of the present generation to use what it needs and all it needs of the natural resources now available. But it recognizes equally our obligation so to use what we need that our descendants shall not be deprived of what they need. Conservation has much to do with the welfare of the average man of today. It proposes to secure a continuous and abundant supply of the necessaries of life, which means a reasonable cost of living and business stability. It advocates fairness in the distribution of the benefits which flow from the natural resources. It will matter very little to the average citizen when scarcity comes and prices rise, whether he cannot get what he needs because there is none left, or because he cannot afford to pay for it. In both cases, the essential fact is that he cannot get what he needs. Conservation holds that it is about as important to see that people in general get the benefit of our natural resources as to see that there shall be natural resources left. conservation is the most democratic movement this country has known for a generation. It holds that the people have not only the right, but the duty to control the use of the natural resources which are the great sources of prosperity. And it regards the absorption of these resources by the special interests unless their operations are under effective public control as a moral wrong. Conservation is the application of common sense to the common problems for the common good, and I believe it stands nearer to the desires, aspirations, and purposes of the average man than any other policy now before the American people. The danger to the conservation policies is that the privileges of the few may continue to obstruct the rights of the many, especially in the matter of water power and coal. Congress must decide immediately whether the great coal fields still in public ownership shall remain so, in order that their use may be controlled with due regard to the interest of the consumer, or whether they shall pass into private ownership and be controlled by the monopolistic interest of a few. Congress must decide also whether immensely valuable rights to the use of water power shall be given away to special interests in perpetuity and without compensation, instead of being held and controlled by the public. In most cases, actual development of water power can best be done by private interests acting under public control. But it is neither good sense nor good morals to let these valuable privileges pass from the public ownership for nothing and forever. Other conservation matters doubtless require action, but these two, the conservation of water power and of coal, the chief sources of power of the present and the future, are clearly the most pressing. It is of the first importance to prevent our water powers from passing into private ownership, as they have been doing, because the greatest source of power we know is falling water. Furthermore, it is the only great unfailing source of power. Our coal, the experts say, is likely to be exhausted during the next century. Our natural gas and oil in this. Our rivers, if the forests on the watersheds are properly handled, will never cease to deliver power. Under our form of civilization, if a few men ever succeeded in controlling the sources of power, they will eventually control all industry as well. If they succeed in controlling all industry, they will necessarily control the country. This country has achieved political freedom. What our people are fighting for now is industrial freedom. And unless we win our industrial liberty, we cannot keep our political liberty. I see no reason why we should deliberately keep on helping to fasten the handcuffs of corporate control upon ourselves for all time, merely because the few men who would profit by it most have heretofore had the power to compel it. The essential things that must be done to protect the water powers for the people are few and simple. First, the granting of water powers forever, either on non-navigable or navigable streams, must absolutely stop. It is perfectly clear that 100, 50, or even 25 years ago, our present industrial conditions and industrial needs were completely beyond the imagination of the wisest of our predecessors. It is just as true that we cannot imagine or foresee the industrial conditions and needs of the future. But we do know that our descendants should be left free to meet their own necessities as they arise. It cannot be right, therefore, for us to grant perpetual rights to one great permanent source of power. It is just as wrong as it is foolish, and just as needless as it is wrong, to mortgage the welfare of our children in such a way as this. Water power must and should be developed mainly by private capital, and they must be developed under conditions which make investment in them profitable and safe. But neither profit nor safety requires perpetual rights, as many of the best water power men now freely acknowledge. Second, the men to whom the people grant the right to use water power should pay for what they get. The water power sites now in the public hands are enormously valuable. There is no reason whatsoever why special interests should be allowed to use them for profit without making some direct payment to the people for the valuable rights derived from the people. This is important not only for the revenue the nation will get, it is at least equally important as a recognition that the public controls its own property and has a right to share in the benefits arising from its development. There are other ways in which public control of water power must be exercised, but these two are the most important. Water power on non-navigable streams usually results from dropping a little water a long way. In the mountains, water is dropped many hundreds of feet upon the turbines which move the dynamos that produce the electric current. Water power on navigable streams is usually produced by dropping immense volumes of water a short distance, as 20 feet, 15 feet, or even less. Every stream is a unit from its source to its mouth, and the people have the same stake in the control of water power in one part of it as in another. Under the Constitution, the United States exercises direct control over navigable streams. It exercises control over non-navigable and source streams only through its ownership of the lands through which they pass, as the public domain and national forests. It is just as essential for the public welfare that the people should retain and exercise control of water power monopoly on navigable as on non-navigable streams. If the difficulties are greater, then the danger that the water powers may pass out of the people's hands on the lower navigable parts of the stream is greater than on the upper non-navigable parts, and it may be harder, but in no way less necessary to prevent it. It must be clear to any man who has followed the development of the conservation idea that no other policy now before the American people is so thoroughly democratic in its essence and in its tendencies as the conservation policy. It asserts that the people have the right and the duty, and that it is their duty no less than their right to protect themselves against the uncontrolled monopoly of the natural resources which yield the necessaries of life. We are beginning to realize that the conservation question is a question of right and wrong, as any question must be which may involve the differences between prosperity and poverty, health and sickness, ignorance and education, well-being and misery, to hundreds of thousands of families. Seen from the point of view of human welfare and human progress, questions which begin as purely economic often end as moral issues. Conservation is a moral issue because it involves the rights and the duties of our people, their rights to prosperity and happiness, and their duties to themselves, to their descendants, and to the whole future progress and welfare of this nation. End of The Moral Issue, taken from The Fight for Conservation by Gifford Pinchot, 1910. Recording by Robert Scott. MojoMove411.com. MojoMove411.com. September the 16th, 2007.
Of Truth by Francis Bacon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. "Certainly there be that delight in giddiness, and count it a bondage to fix a belief, affecting free will in thinking, as well as in acting. And though the sects of philosophers of that kind be gone, yet there remain certain discoursing wits, which are of the same veins, though there be not so much blood in them, as was in those of the ancients. But it is not only the difficulty and labor which men take in finding out of truth, nor again that when it is found, it imposeth upon men's thoughts that doth bring lies in favor, but a natural, though corrupt love of the lie itself. One of the later school of the Grecians examineth the matter, and is at a stand, to think what should be in it, that men should love lies, where neither they make for pleasure as with poets, nor for advantage as with the merchant, but for the lie's sake. But I cannot tell. This same truth is a naked and open daylight that doth not show the masks and mummeries and triumphs of the world, half so stately and daintily as candle lights. Truth may perhaps come to the price of a pearl, that showeth best by day, but it will not rise to the price of a diamond, or carbuncle, that showeth best in varied lights. A mixture of a lie doth ever add pleasure. Doth any man doubt that if there were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men, poor, shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition, and unpleasing to themselves? One of the fathers, in great severity, called poesy vinum daemonum, the devil's wine, because it filleth the imagination, and yet it is but with the shadow of a lie. But it is not the lie that passeth through the mind, but the lie that sinketh in, and settleth in it, that doth the hurt, such as we spake of before. But howsoever these things are thus in men's depraved judgments and affections, yet truth, which only doth judge itself, teacheth that the inquiry of truth, which is the love-making or wooing of it, the knowledge of truth, which is the presence of it, and the belief of truth, which is the enjoying of it, is the sovereign good of human nature. The first creature of God, in the works of the days, was the light of the sense. The last was the light of reason. And his Sabbath work ever since is the illumination of his spirit. First he breathed light upon the face of the matter or chaos. Then he breathed light into the face of man. And still he breatheth and inspireth light into the face of his chosen. The poet that beautified the sect, that was otherwise inferior to the rest, saith yet excellently well, "It is a pleasure to stand upon the shore, and to see ships tossed upon the sea, a pleasure to stand in the window of a castle and to see a battle, and the adventures thereof below. But no pleasure is comparable to the standing upon the vantage ground of truth, a hill not to be commanded, and where the air is always clear and serene, and to see the errors and wanderings and mists and tempests in the vale below. So always let this prospect be with pity, and not with swelling or pride. Certainly, it is heaven upon earth to have a man's mind move in charity, rest in providence, and turn upon the poles of truth. To pass from theological and philosophical truth to the truth of civil business, it will be acknowledged, even by those that practice it not, that clear and round dealing is the honor of man's nature, and that mixture of falsehoods is like alloy and coin of gold and silver, which may make the metal work the better, but it embaseth it. For these winding and crooked courses are the goings of the serpent, which goeth basely upon the belly, and not upon the feet. There is no vice that doth so cover a man with shame, as to be found false and perfidious. And therefore Montaigne saith prettily, when he inquired the reason why the word of the lie should be such a disgrace, and such an odious charge, saith he, if it be well weighed, to say that a man lieth, is as much to say as that he is brave towards God, and a coward towards men. For a lie faces God, and shrinks from man. Surely the wickedness of falsehood and breach of faith cannot possibly be so highly expressed, as in that it shall be the last peal, to call the judgments of God upon the generations of men, it being foretold that when Christ cometh, he shall not find faith upon the earth. End of Truth by Francis Bacon. Read by Cody Logan.
On Old Age by Cicero. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. And should my service, Titus, ease the weight of care that wrings your heart, and draw the sting which rankles there, what guerdon shall there be? For I may address you, Atticus, in the lines in which Flamininus was addressed by the man who, poor in wealth, was rich in honor's gold. Though I am well assured that you are not, as Flamininus was, kept on the rack of care by night and day. For I know how well ordered and equable your mind is, and am fully aware that it was not a surname alone which we brought home with you from Athens, but its culture and good sense. And yet, I have an idea that you are at times stirred to the heart by the same circumstances as myself. To console you for these is a more serious matter, and must be put off to another time. For the present, I have resolved to dedicate to you an essay on old age. For from the burden of impending, or at least advancing age, common to us both, I would do something to relieve us both. Though as to yourself, I am fully aware that you support and will support it as you do everything else, with calmness and philosophy. But directly I resolved to write on old age, you at once occurred to me as a deserving a gift of which both of us might take advantage. To myself, indeed, the composition of this book has been so delightful that it has not only wiped away all the disagreeables of old age, but has even made it luxurious and delightful too. Never, therefore, can philosophy be praised as highly as it deserves, considering that its faithful disciple is able to spend every period of his life with unruffled feelings. However, on other subjects I have spoken at large, and shall often speak again. This book which I herewith send to you is on old age. I have put the whole discourse not, as Alisto of Cos did, in the mouth of Tithonus, for a mere fable would have lacked conviction, but in that of Marcus Cato, when he was an old man, to give my essay greater weight. I represent Laelius and Scipio at his house, expressing surprise at his carrying his years so lightly, and Cato answering them. If he shall seem to show somewhat more learning in this discourse than he generally did in his own books, put it down to Greek literature, of which it is known that he became an eager student in his old age. But what need of more? Cato's own words will at once explain all I feel about old age. M. Cato, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus the Younger, Gaius Laelius. Scipio. Many a time have I in conversation with my friend Gaius Laelius here expressed my admiration, Marcus Cato, of the eminent, nay, perfect wisdom displayed by you indeed at all points, but above everything because I have noticed that old age never seemed a burden to you, when to most old men it is so hateful that they declare themselves under a weight heavier than Etna. Cato. Your admiration is easily excited, it seems, my dear Scipio and Laelius. Men, of course, who have no resources in themselves for securing a good and happy life, find every age burdensome. But those who look for all happiness from within can never think anything bad which nature makes inevitable. In that category, before anything else comes old age, to which all wish to attain, and at which all grumble when attained. Such as folly's inconsistency and unreasonableness. They say that it is stealing upon them faster than they expected. In the first place, who compelled them to hug an illusion? For in what respect did old age steal upon manhood faster than manhood upon childhood? In the next place, in what way would old age have been less disagreeable to them if they were in their 800th year than their 80th? For the past, however long, when once it was past, would have no consolation for a stupid old age. Wherefore, if it is your wont to admire my wisdom, and I would that it were worthy of your good opinion, and of my own name of sapiens, it really consists in the fact that I follow nature, the best of guides, as I would a god, and am loyal to her commands. It is not likely, if she has written the rest of the play well, that she has been careless about the last act like some idle poet. But after all, some, quote, last was inevitable. Just as to the berries of a tree and the fruits of the earth there comes in the fullness of time a period of decay and fall. A wise man will not make a grievance of this. To rebel against nature, is that not to fight like the giants with the gods? Laelius. And yet, Cato, you will do us a very great favor. I venture to speak for Scipio as for myself. If, since we all hope, or at least wish, to become old men, you would allow us to learn from you in good time before it arrives by what methods we most easily acquire the strength to support the burden of advancing age. Cato. I will do so without doubt, Laelius, especially if, as you say, it will be agreeable to Scipio as well. Laelius. We do wish very much, Cato, if it's no trouble to you, to be allowed to see the nature of the bourne which you have reached after completing a long journey, as it were, upon which we too are to embark. Cato. I will do the best that I can, Laelius. It has often been my fortune to hear the complaints of my contemporaries. Like will to like. You know, according to the old proverb, complaints to which men like Salinator and Albinus, who were of consular rank and about my time, used to give vent. They were, first, that they had lost the pleasures of the senses, without which they did not regard life as full at all. And secondly, that they were neglected by those from whom they had been used to receive attentions. Such men appear to me to lay the blame on the wrong thing. For if it had been the fault of old age, then these same misfortunes would befall me and all other men of advanced years. But I have known many of them who never said a word of complaint against old age, for they were only too glad to be freed from the bondage of passion, and were not looked at all down upon by their friends. The fact is that the blame for all complaints of that kind is to be charged to character, not to a particular time of life. For old men who are reasonable and neither cross-grained nor churlish find old age tolerable enough, whereas unreason and churlishness cause uneasiness at every time of life. Laelius. It is as you say, Cato, but perhaps someone may suggest that it is your large means, wealth, and high position that makes you think old age tolerable, whereas such good fortune only falls to few. Cato. There is something in that, Laelius, but but by no means all. For instance, the story is told of the answer of Themistocles in a wrangle with a certain Seraphian, who asserted that he owed his brilliant position to the reputation of his country, not to his own. Quote, "If I had been a Seraphian," said he, "even I should never have been famous, nor would you if you had been an Athenian." End quote. Something like this may be said of old age, for the philosopher himself could not find old age easy to bear in the depths of poverty, nor the fool fear anything but a burden though he were a millionaire. You may be sure, my dear Scipio and Laelius, that the arms best adapted to old age are culture and the active exercise of virtues. For if they have been maintained at every period, if one has lived much as well as long, the harvest they produce is wonderful, not only because they never fail us even in our last days, though that in itself is supremely important, but also because the consciousness of a well-spent life and the recollection of many virtuous actions are exceedingly delightful. Take the case of Fabius Maximus, the man, who recovered Tarentum. When I was a young man, and he an old one, I was as much attached to him as if he had been my contemporary. For that great man's serious dignity was tempered by courteous manners, nor had old age made any change in his character. True, he was not exactly an old man when my devotion to him began, yet he was nevertheless well on in life, for his first consulship fell in a year after my birth. When quite a stripling, I went with him in his fourth consulship as a soldier in the ranks on the expedition against Capua, and in the 5th year after that against Tarentum. 4 years after that, I was elected quaestor, holding office in the consulship of Tudantius and Cethegus, in which year indeed he as a very old man spoke in favor of the Socinian law, quote, on gifts and fees, end quote. Now this man conducted wars with all the spirit of youth when he was far advanced in life, and by his persistence gradually wearied out Hannibal when riding in all the confidence of his youth. How brilliant are those lines of my friend Ennius on him. For us, downbeaten by the storms of fate, one man by wise delays restored the state. Praise or dispraise moved not his constant mood, true to his purpose, to his country's good. Down ever-lengthening avenues of fame thus shines and shall shine still his glorious name. Again, what vigilance, what profound skill did he show in the capture of Tarentum. It was indeed in my hearing that he made his famous retort to Salinator, who had retreated into the citadel after losing the town. Quote, "It was owing to me, Quintus Fabius, that you retook Tarentum." "Quite so," he replied with a laugh, "for had you not lost it, I should never have recovered it." Nor was he less eminent in civil life than in war. In his second consulship, though his colleague would not move in the matter, he resisted as long as he could the proposal of the tribune Flamininus to divide the territory of the Picenians and Gauls in free allotments in defiance of the resolution of the Senate. Again, though he was an augur, he ventured to say that whatever was done in the interest of the state was done with the best possible auspices, that any laws proposed against its interest were proposed against the auspices. I was cognizant of much that was admirable in that great man, but nothing struck me with greater astonishment than the way in which he bore the death of his son, a man of brilliant character, and who had been consul. His funeral speech over him is in wide circulation, and when we read it, is there any philosopher of whom we do not think meanly? Nor in truth was he only great in the light of day and in the sight of his fellow citizens. He was still more eminent in private and at home. What a wealth of conversation! What weighty maxims! What a wide acquaintance with ancient history! What an accurate knowledge of the science of augury! For a Roman, too, he had a great tincture of letters. He had a tenacious memory for military history of every sort, whether of Roman or of foreign wars. And I used at that time to enjoy his conversation with a passionate eagerness, as though I had already divined what actually turned out to be the case, that when he died there would be no one to teach me anything. What, then, is the purpose of such a long disquisition on Maximus? It is because you now see that old age like his cannot conscientiously be called unhappy. Yet it is, after all, true that everybody cannot be a Scipio or a Maximus, with storming of cities, with battles by land and sea, with wars in which they themselves commanded, and with triumphs to recall. Besides this, there is a quiet, pure, and cultivated life, which produces a calm and gentle old age, such as we have been told Plato's was, who died at his writing desk in his 81st year, or like that of Isocrates, who says that he wrote the book called the Panegyric in his 94th year, and who lived for 5 years afterwards, while his master, Grotius of Leontini, completed 107 years without ever relaxing his diligence or giving up work. When someone asked him why he consented to remain so long alive, "I have no fault," said he, "to find with old age." That was a noble answer, and worthy of a scholar. For fools impute their own frailties and guilt to old age, contrary to the practice of Ennius, whom I mentioned just now, in the lines, "Like some brave steed that oft before the Olympic wreath of victory bore, now by the weight of years oppressed, forgets the race, and takes his rest." He compares his own old age to that of a high-spirited and successful racehorse. And him indeed you may very well remember, for the present consuls Titus Flamininus and Manius Acilius were elected in the 90th year after his death, and his death occurred in the consulship of Capio and Philippus, the latter consul for the second time, in which year I, then 66 years old, spoke in favor of the Voconian law in a voice that was still strong with lungs still sound, while he, though 70 years old, supported two burdens considered the heaviest of all, poverty and old age, in such a way as to be all but fond of them. The fact is, that when I come to think it over, I find there are 4 reasons for old age being thought unhappy. First, that it withdraws us from active employment. Second, that it enfeebles the body. Third, that it deprives us of nearly all physical pleasures. Fourth, that it is the next step to death. Of each of these reasons, if you will allow me, let us examine the force and justice separately. Old age withdraws us from active employments. From which of them? Do you mean from those carried on by youth and bodily strength? Are there then no old men's employments to be after all conducted by the intellect, even when bodies are weak? So then Maximus did nothing, nor Aemilius, your father, Scipio, and my excellent son's father-in-law. So with other old men, the Fabrici, the Curii, the Corinzani, when they were supporting the state by their advice and influence, they were doing nothing. To old age, Appius Claudius had the additional disadvantage of being blind. Yet it was he who, when the state was inclining towards a peace with Pyrrhus and was making for a treaty, did not hesitate to say what Ennius has embalmed in the verses. "Whither have swerved the souls so firm of yore? Is sense growing senseless? Can feet stand no more?" And so on, in a tone of the most passionate vehemence. You know the poem, and the speech of Appius himself is extant. Now he delivered it 17 years after his second consulship, there having been an interval of 10 years between the two consulships, and he having been censured before his previous consulship. This will show you that at the time of the war with Pyrrhus he was a very old man. Yet, this is the story handed down to us. There is therefore nothing in the arguments of those who say that old age takes no part in public business. They are like men who would say that a steersman does nothing in sailing a ship, because while some of the crew are climbing the mast, others hurrying up and down the gangways, others pumping out the bilge water, he sits quietly in the stern holding the tiller. He does not do what young men do. Nevertheless, he does what is much more important and better. The great affairs of life are not performed by physical strength, or activity, or nimbleness of body, but by deliberation, character, expression of opinion. Of these, old age is not only not deprived, but as a rule has them in greater degree. Unless by any chance I, who as a soldier in the ranks, as military tribune, as legate, and as consul have been employed in various kinds of war, now appear to you to be idle because not actively engaged in war. But I enjoined upon the Senate what is to be done and how. Carthage has long been harboring evil designs, and I accordingly proclaim war against her in good time. I shall never cease to entertain fears about her till I hear of her having been leveled with the ground. The glory of doing that I pray to the immortal gods may reserve to you, Scipio, so that you may complete the task begun by your grandfather, now dead more than 32 years ago, though all the years to come will keep that great man's memory green. He died in the year before my censorship, 9 years after my consulship, having been returned consul for a second time in my own consulship. If, then, he had lived to his 100th year, would he have regretted having lived to be old? For he would of course not have been practicing rapid marches, nor dashing on a foe, nor hurling spears from a distance, nor using swords at close quarters, but only counsel, reason, and senatorial eloquence. And if those qualities had not resided in us seniors, our ancestors would never have called their supreme council a senate. At Sparta, indeed, those who hold the highest magistracies are in accordance with the fact actually called elders. But if you take the trouble to read or listen to foreign history, you will find that the mightiest states have been brought into peril by young men, have been supported and restored by old. The question occurs in the poet Nevius' sport. Pray, who are those who brought your state with such dispatch to meet its fate? There is a long answer, but this is the chief point. A crop of brand new orators regrew, and foolish paltry lads who thought they knew. For of course rashness is the note of youth, prudence of old age. But it is said memory dwindles. No doubt, unless you keep it in practice, or if you happen to be somewhat dull by nature. Themistocles had the names of all his fellow citizens by heart. Do you imagine that in his old age he used to address Aristides as Lysimachus? For my part, I know not only the present generation, but their father also and their grandfathers. Nor have I any fear of losing my memory by reading tombstones, according to the vulgar superstition. On the contrary, by reading them I renew my memory of those who are dead and gone. Nor, in point of fact, have I ever heard of any old man forgetting where he has hidden his money. They remember everything that interests them. When to answer to their bail, business appointments, who owes them money, and to whom they owe it. What about lawyers, pontiffs, augurs, philosophers when old? What a multitude of things they remember. Old men retain their intellects well enough, if only they keep their minds active and fully employed. Nor is that the case only with men of high position and great office. It applies equally to private life and peaceful pursuits. Sophocles composed tragedies to extreme old age, and being brought to court to get a judicial decision depriving him of the management of his property on the grounds of weak intellect, just as in our law it is customary to deprive a paterfamilias of the management of his property if he is squandering it. Thereupon, the old poet is said to have read to the judges the play he had on hand and had just composed, the Oedipus Colonius, and to have asked them whether they thought that the work of a man of weak intellect. After reading, he was acquitted by the jury. Did old age then compel this man to become silent in his particular act, or Homer, Hesiod, Simonides, or Isocrates and Gorgias, whom I mentioned before, or the founders of schools of philosophy, Pythagoras, Democritus, Plato, Xenocrates, or later Zeno and Cleanthes, or Diogenes the Stoic, whom you too saw at Rome? Is it not rather the case with all these that the active pursuit of study only ended with life? But to pass over these sublime studies, I can name some rustic Romans from the Sabine district, neighbors and friends of my own, without whose presence farm work of importance is scarcely ever performed, whether sowing or harvesting or storing crops. And yet, in other things, this is less surprising, for no one is so old to think that he may not live a year. But they bestow their labor on what they know does not affect them in any case. He plants his trees to serve a race to come, as our old poet Statius say in his Comrades. Nor indeed would the farmer, however old, hesitate to answer anyone who asked him for what he was planting. For the immortal gods, whose will it was that I should not merely receive these things from my ancestors, but should also hand them on to the next generation. That remark about the old man is better than the following. If age brought nothing worse than this, it were enough to mar our bliss, that he who bides for many years sees much to shun and much for tears. Yes, and perhaps much that gives him pleasure too. Besides, as the subjects for tears, he often comes upon them in youth as well. A still more questionable sentiment in the same Cecilius is, no greater misery can of age be told than this, be sure the young dislike the old. Delight in them is nearer the mark than dislike. For just as old men, if they are wise, take pleasure in the society of young men of good parts, and as old age is rendered less dreary for those who are courted and liked by the youth, so also do young men find pleasures in the maxims of the old, by which they are drawn to the pursuit of excellence. Nor do I perceive that you find my society less pleasant than I do yours. But this is enough to show you how, so far from being listless and sluggish, old age is ever a busy time, always doing and attempting something, of course of the same nature as each man's taste had been in the previous part of his life. Nay, do not some even add to their stock of learning? We see Solon, for instance, boasting his poems that he grows old, quote, daily learning something new, end quote. Or again, in my own case, it was only when an old man that I became acquainted with Greek literature, which in fact I absorbed with such avidity in my yearning to quench, as it were, a long-continued thirst, that I became acquainted with the very facts which you now see me using as precedents. When I heard what Socrates had done about the lyre, I should have liked for my part to have done that too, for the ancients used it to learn the lyre, but at any rate, I worked hard at literature. Nor again do I now miss the bodily strength of a young man, for that was the second point as to the disadvantages of old age, any more than as a young man I miss the strength of a bull or an elephant. You should use what you have, and at whatever you may chance to be doing, do it with all your might. What could be weaker than Milo of Croton's exclamation? When in his old age he was watching some athletes practicing in the course, he is said to have looked at his arms and to have exclaimed with tears in his eyes, "Ah, well, these are now as good as dead." Not a bit more so than yourself, you trifler. For at no time were you made famous by your real self, but by the chest and biceps. Sextinius Aelius never gave vent to such a remark, nor, many years before him, Titus Coruncinanus, nor more recently P. Crassus. All of them learned jurisconsults in active practice, whose knowledge of their profession was maintained to their last breath. I am afraid that an orator does lose vigor by old age, for his art is not a matter of the intellect alone, but of lungs and bodily strength. Though as a rule that musical ring in the voice even gains in brilliance in a certain way as one grows old. Certainly I have not yet lost it, and you see my years. Yet after all, the style of speech suitable to an old man is the quiet and unemotional, and it often happens that the chastened and calm delivery of an old man eloquent secures a hearing. If you cannot attain that yourself, you might still instruct a Scipio and a Laelius, for what is more charming than old age surrounded by the enthusiasm of youth? Shall we not allow old age even the strength to teach the young, to train and equip them for all the duties of life? And what can be a nobler employment? For my part, I used to think Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, and your two grandfathers, Aemilius and Africanus, fortunate men when I saw them with a company of young nobles about them. Nor should we think any teachers of the fine arts otherwise than happy, however much of their bodily forces may have decayed and failed. And yet that same failure of the body forces is more often brought about by the vices of youth than of old age, for a dissolute and intemperate youth hands down the body to old age in a worn-out state. Xenophon Cyrus, for instance, in his discourse delivered on his deathbed and at a very advanced age, says that he never perceived his old age to have become weaker than his youth had been. I remember as a boy Lucius Metellus, who, having been created Pontifex Maximus 4 years after his second consulship, held that office 22 years, enjoying such excellent strength of body in the very last hours of his life as to not miss his youth. I need not speak of myself, though that indeed is an old man's way and is generally allowed into my time of life. Don't you see in Homer how frequently Nestor talks of his own good qualities? For he was living through a third generation, nor had he any reason to fear that upon saying what was true about himself, he should appear either over-vain or talkative. For as Homer says, quote, "From his lips flowed discourse sweeter than honey," end quote, for which sweet breath he wanted no bodily strength. And yet, after all, the famous leader of the Greeks nowhere wishes to have 10 men like Ajax, but like Nestor, if he could get them, he feels no doubt of Troy shortly falling. But to return to my own case, I am in my 84th year. I could wish that I had been able to make the same boast to Cyrus, but after all I can say this. I am not indeed as vigorous as I was as a private soldier in the Punic War, or as a quaestor in the same war, or as a consul in Spain, and 4 years later when as military tribune I took part in the engagement at Thermopylae under the consul Marcus Aecius Glabrio. But yet, as you see, old age has not entirely destroyed my muscles, has not quite brought me to the ground. The Senate House does not find all my vigor gone, nor the rostra, nor my friends, nor my clients, nor my foreign guests. For I have never given in to that ancient and much praised proverb, "Old when young is old for long." For myself, I had rather be an old man a somewhat shorter time than an old man before my time. Accordingly, no one up to the present has wished to see me to whom I have been denied as engaged. But, as it may be said, I have less strength than either of you. Neither have you the strength of the centurion T. Pontius. Is he the more eminent man on that account? Let there be only a proper husbanding of strength, and let each man proportion his efforts to his powers. Such a one will assuredly not be possessed with any great regret for his loss of strength. At Olympia, Milo is said to have stepped into the course carrying a live ox on his shoulders. Which, then, of the two would you prefer to have given to you? Bodily strength like that, or intellectual strength like that of Pythagoras? In fine, enjoy the blessing when you have it. When it is gone, don't wish it back. Unless we are to think that young men should wish their childhood back, and those somewhat older their youth. The course of life is fixed, and nature admits of it being run but in one way, and only once, and to each part of our life there is something specially seasonable, so that the feebleness of children, as well as the high spirit of youth, the soberness of mature years, and the ripe wisdom of old age, all have a certain natural advantage which should be secured in its proper season. I think you are informed, Scipio, what your grandfather's foreign friend Massinissa does to this day, though 90 years old. When he has once begun a journey on foot, he does not mount his horse at all. When on horseback, he never gets off his horse. By no rain or cold can he be induced to cover his head. His body is absolutely free from unhealthy humors, and so he still performs all the duties and functions of a king. Active exercise, therefore, and temperance can preserve some part of one's former strength, even in old age. Bodily strength is wanting to old age, but neither is bodily strength demanded from old men. Therefore, both by law and custom, men of my time of life are exempt from those duties which cannot be supported without bodily strength. Accordingly, not only are we not forced to do what we cannot do, we are not even obliged to do as much as we can. But, it will be said, many old men are so feeble that they cannot perform any duty in life of any sort or kind. That is not a weakness to be set down as peculiar to old age. It is one shared by ill health. How feeble was the son of Africanus who adopted you? What weak health he had, or rather no health at all. If that had not been the case, we should have had him in a second brilliant light in the political horizon, for he had added a wider cultivation to his father's greatness of spirit. What wonder, then, that old men are eventually feeble, when even the young cannot escape it? My dear Laelius and Scipio, we must stand up against old age and make up for its drawbacks by taking pains. We must fight it as we should an illness. We must look after our health, use moderate exercise, take just enough food and drink to recruit but not to overload our strength. Nor is it the body alone that must be supported, but the intellect and soul much more, for they are like lamps. Unless you feed them with oil, they too go out from old age. Again, the body is apt to get gross from exercise, but the intellect becomes nimbler by exercising itself. For what Cecilius means by, quote, old dotards of the comic stage, end quote, are the credulous, the forgetful, and the slipshod. These are faults that do not attach to old age as such, but to a sluggish, spiritless, and sleepy old age. Young men are more frequently wanton and dissolute than old men. But yet, as it is not all young men that are so, but the bad set among them, even so senile folly, usually called imbecility, applies to old men of unsound character, not to all. Appius governed 4 sturdy sons, 5 daughters, that great establishment, and all those clients, though he was both old and blind. For he kept his mind at full stretch like a bow, and never gave in to old age by growing slack. He maintained not merely an influence, but an absolute command over his family. His slaves feared him, his sons were in awe of him, all loved him. In that family, indeed, ancestral custom and discipline were in full vigor. The fact is that old age is respectable, just as long as it asserts itself, maintains its proper rights, and is not enslaved to anyone. For as I admire a young man who has something of the old man in him, so do I an old one who has something of a young man. The man who aims at this may possibly become old in body. In mind he never will. I am now engaged in composing the 7th book of my Origins. I collect all the records of antiquity, the speeches delivered in all celebrated cases which I have defended. I am at this particular time getting into shape for publication. I am writing treatises on augural, pontifical, and civil law. I am, besides, studying hard at Greek, and after the manner of the Pythagoreans, to keep my memory in working order, I repeat in the evening whatever I have said, heard, or done in the course of each day. These are the exercises of the intellect, these the training grounds of the mind. While I sweat and labor on these, I don't much feel the loss of bodily strength. I appear in court for my friends. I frequently attend the Senate and bring motions before it on my own responsibility, prepared after deep and long reflections. And these I support by my intellectual, not my bodily forces. And if I were not strong enough to do these things, yet I should enjoy my sofa, imagining the very operations which I was now unable to perform. But what makes me capable of doing this is my past life. For a man who is always living in the midst of these studies and labors does not perceive when old age creeps up on him. Thus, by slow and imperceptible degrees, life draws to an end. There is no sudden breakage. It just slowly goes out. The third charge against old age is that it lacks sensual pleasures. What a splendid service does old age render, if it takes from us the greatest blot of youth! Listen, my dear young friends, to a speech of Grotius of Tarentum, among the greatest and most illustrious of men, which was put into my hands when as a young man I was at Tarentum with Maximus. Quote, "No more deadly curse than sensual pleasure has been inflicted on mankind by nature, to gratify which our wanton appetites are roused beyond all prudence or restraint. It is a fruitful source of treasons, revolutions, secret communications with the enemy. In fact, there is no crime, no evil deed, to which the appetite for sensual pleasures does not impel us. Fornications and adulteries, and every abomination of that kind, are brought about by the enticements of pleasure and by them alone. Intellect is the best gift of nature or God. To this divine gift and endowment there is nothing so inimical as pleasure. For when appetite is our master, there is no place for self-control, nor where pleasure reigns supreme can virtue hold its ground. To see this more vividly, imagine a man excited to the highest conceivable pitch of sensual pleasure. It can be doubtful to no one that such a person, so long as under the influence of such excitation of the senses, will be unable to use to any purpose either intellect, reason, or thought. Therefore nothing can be so execrable and so fatal as pleasure, since, when more than ordinarily violent and lasting, it darkens all the light of the soul." End quote. These were the words addressed by Grotius to the Samnite Gaius Pontius, father of the man by whom the consuls Spurius Postumus and Titus Vertorius were beaten in the battle of Caudium. My friend Nercius of Tarentum, who had remained loyal to Rome, told me that he has heard them repeated by some old men, and that Plato the Athenian was present, who visited Tarentum, I find, in the consulship of Camillus and Appius Claudius. What is the point of all this? It is to show you that, if we were unable to scorn pleasure by the aid of reason and philosophy, we ought to have been very grateful to old age for depriving us of all inclination for that which it was wrong to do. For pleasure hinders thought, is a foe to reason, and, so to speak, blinds the eyes of the mind. It is, moreover, entirely alien to virtue. I was sorry to have to expel Lucius, brother of the gallant Titius Flamininus, from the Senate 7 years after his consulship, but I thought it imperative to affix a stigma on an act of gross sensuality. For when he was in Gaul as consul, he had yielded to the entreaties of a paramour at a dinner party to behead a man who happened to be in prison condemned on a capital charge. When his brother Titus was censor, who preceded me, he escaped. But I and Flaccus could not countenance an act of such criminal and abandoned lust, especially as, besides the personal dishonor, it brought disgrace on the government. I have been told by men older than myself, who said that they have heard it as boys from older men, that Gaius Fabricius was in the habit of expressing astonishment at having heard, when envoy at the headquarters of King Pyrrhus, from the Thessalian Cineas, that there was a man of Athens who professed to be a philosopher, and who affirmed that everything we did was to be referred to as pleasure. When he told this to Manius Curius and Publius Decius, they used to remark that they wished that the Samnites and Pyrrhus himself would hold the same opinion. It would be much easier to conquer them if they had once given themselves over to sensual indulgence. Manius Curius had been intimate with P. Decius, who 4 years before the former's consulship had devoted himself to death for the Republic. Both Fabricius and Coruncanius knew him also, and from the experience of their own lives, as well as from the action of Decius, they were of the opinion that there did exist something intrinsically noble and great, which was sought for its own sake, and at which all the best men aimed, to the contempt and neglect of pleasure. Why then do I spend so many words on the subject of pleasure? Why, because, far from being a charge against old age that it does not much feel the want of any pleasure, it is its highest praise. But, you will say, it is deprived of the pleasures of the table, the heaping up board, the rapid passing of the wine cup. Well then, it is also free from headache, disordered digestion, broken sleep. But if we must grant pleasure something, since we do not find it easy to resist its charms, for Plato with happy inspiration calls pleasure vice's bait, because of course men are caught by it as a fish by a hook. Yet although old age has to abstain from extravagant banquets, it is still capable of enjoying modest festivities. As a boy, I often used to see Gaius Duilius, the son of Marcus, then an old man, returning from a dinner party. He thoroughly enjoyed the frequent use of torch and flute player, distinctions which he had assumed, though unprecedented in the case of a private person. It was the privilege of his glory. But why mention others? I will come back to my own case. To begin with, I have always remained a member of a club. Clubs, you know, were established in my quaestorship on reception of the Magna Mater from Ida. So I used to dine at their feast with members of my club, on the whole with moderation, though there was a certain warmth of temperamental natural in my time of life. But as that advances, there is a daily decrease of all excitement. Nor was I, in fact, ever wont to measure my enjoyment even of these banquets by the physical pleasures they gave more than by the gathering and conversation of friends. For it was a good idea of our ancestors to style the presence of guests at a dinner table, seeing that it implied a community of enjoyment, a convivium, a living together. It is a better term than the Greek words which mean a drinking together or an eating together, for they would seem to give the preference to what is really the least important part of it. For myself, owing to the pleasure I take in conversation, I enjoy even banquets that begin early in afternoon, and not only in company with my contemporaries, of whom very few survive, but also with men of your age and with yourselves. I am thankful to old age, which has decreased my avidity for conversation, while it has removed that for eating and drinking. But if anyone does enjoy these, not to seem to have proclaimed war against all pleasure without exception, which is perhaps a feeling inspired by nature, I fail to perceive even in these very pleasures that old age is entirely without the power of appreciation. For myself, I take delight even in the old-fashioned appointment of master of the feast, and in the arrangement of the conversation, which according to ancestral custom is begun from the last place on the left-hand couch when the wine is brought in, and also in the cups which, as in Xenophon's banquet, are small and filled by driblets, and in the contrivance for cooling in the summer and for warming in the winter sun or winter fire. These things I keep up even among my Sabine countrymen, and every day have a full dinner party of neighbors, which we prolong as far into the night as we can with varied conversation. But you may urge, there is not the same tingling sensation of pleasure in old men. No doubt, but neither do they miss it so much. For nothing gives you uneasiness which you do not miss. That was a fine answer of Sophocles to a man who asked him when in extreme old age whether he was still a lover. Heaven forbid, he replied. I was only too glad to escape from that, as though from a boorish and insane master. The men, indeed, who are keen after such things, it may possibly appear disagreeable and uncomfortable to be without them. But to jaded appetites, it is pleasanter to lack than to enjoy. However, he cannot be said to lack who does not want. My contention is not to want is the pleasanter thing. But even granting that youth enjoys these pleasures with more zest, in the first place they are insignificant things to enjoy, as I have said. And in the second place, such as age is not entirely without, if it does not possess them in profusion. Just as a man gets greater pleasure from Ambivius Turpio if seated in the front row of the theater than if he was in the last, yet, after all, the man in the last row does get pleasure. So youth, because it looks at pleasure at close quarters, perhaps enjoys it more. Yet even old age, looking at them from a distance, does enjoy itself well enough. Why, what blessings are these, that the soul, having served its time, so to speak, in the campaigns of desire and ambition, rivalry and hatred, and all the passions, should live in its own thoughts, and, as the expression goes, should dwell apart. Indeed, if it has in store any of what I may call the food of study and philosophy, nothing can be pleasanter than an old age of leisure. We were witnesses to Gallius, the friend of your father Scipio, intent to the day of his death on mapping out the sky and land. How often did delight surprise him when still working on a problem begun during the night? How often did night find him busy on what he had begun at dawn? How he delighted in predicting for us solar and lunar eclipses long before they occurred. Or again, in studies of a lighter nature, though still requiring keenness of intellect, what a pleasure Nevius took in his Punic War, Platus in his Truculentus and Pseudolus, I even saw Livius Andronicus, who, having produced the play 6 years before I was born, in the consulship of Cinto and Tudantius, lived till I become a young man. Why speak of Publius Licinius Crassus devoted to pontifical and civical law, or Publius Scipio of the present time, who within these last few days has been created Pontifex Maximus? And yet I have seen all whom I have mentioned ardent in these pursuits when old men. Then there is Marcus Cethegus, whom Ennius just called, quote, persuasion's marrow, quote. With what enthusiasm did we see him exert himself in oratory even when quite old? What pleasure are there in feasts, games, or mistresses compared to the pleasures such as these? And they are all tastes, too, connected with learning, which in men of sense and good education grow with their growth. It is indeed an honorable sentiment which Solon expresses in a verse, which I have quoted before, that he grew old learning many a fresh lesson every day. Than that intellectual pleasure none certainly can be greater. I come now to the pleasures of the farmer, in which I take amazing delight. These are not hindered by any extent of old age, and seem to me to approach nearest the ideal wise man's life. For he has to deal with the earth, which never refuses its obedience, nor ever returns what it has received without usury, sometimes indeed with less, but generally with greater interest. For my part, however, it is not merely the thing produced, but the earth's own force and natural productiveness that delight me. For having received in its bosom the seed scattered broadcast upon it, softened and broken up, she first keeps it concealed therein. Hence the harrowing which accomplishes this gets its name from a word meaning to hide. Next, when it has been warmed by her heat and close pressure, she splits it open and draws from it the greenery of the blade. This, supported by the fibers of the root, little by little grows up, and held upright by its jointed stalk is enclosed in sheets, as still being immature. When it has emerged from them, it produces an ear of corn arranged in order, and is defended against the pecking of the smaller birds by a regular palisade of spikes. Need I mention the starting, planting, and growing of vines? I can never have too much of this pleasure. To let you into the secret what gives my old age repose and amusement. For I say nothing here of the natural force which all things propagated from the earth possess, the earth from which that tiny grain in a fig, or the grapestone in a grape, or the most minute seeds of the other cereals and plants produces such huge trunks and boughs. Mallet, shoots, slips, cuttings, quicksets, layers, are they not enough to fill any one with delight and astonishment? The vine by nature is apt to fall, and unless supported, drops down to earth. Yet in order to keep itself upright, it embraces whatever it reaches with its tendrils as though they were hands. Then, as it creeps on, spreading itself in intricate and wild profusion, the dresser's art prunes it with a knife and prevents it growing a forest of shoots and expanding to excess in every direction. Accordingly, at the beginning of spring in the shoots which have been left there protrudes at each of the joints what is termed an eye. From this, the grape emerges and shows itself, which, swollen by the juice of the earth and heat of the sun, is at first very bitter to the taste, but afterward grows sweet as it matures, and being covered with tendrils is never without a moderate warmth, and yet is able to ward off the fiery heat of the sun. Can anything be richer in product or more beautiful to contemplate? It is not its utility only, as I said before, that charms me, but the method of its cultivation and the natural process of its growth, the rows of uprights, the cross pieces for the tops of the plants, the tying up of the vines in their propagation by layers, the pruning, to which I have already referred, of some shoots, the setting of others. I need hardly mention irrigation or trenching and digging the soil, which much increase its fertility. As to the advantages of manuring, I have spoken in my book of agriculture. The learned Hesiod did not say a single word on the subject, though he was writing on the cultivation of soil. Yet Homer, who in my opinion was many generations earlier, represents Laertes as softening his regret for his son by cultivating and manuring his farm. Nor is it only in cornfields and meadows and vineyards and plantations that a farmer's life is made cheerful. There are the garden and the orchard, the feeding of sheep, the swarms of bees, endless varieties of flowers. Nor is it only planting out that charms. There is also grafting, surely the most ingenious invention ever made by husbandmen. I might continue my list of the delights of country life, but even what I have said I think is somewhat overlong. However, you must pardon me, for farming is a very favorite hobby of mine, and old age is naturally rather garrulous. For I would not be thought to acquitted of all faults. Well, It was in a life of this sort that Manius Curius, after celebrating triumphs over the Samnites, the Sabines, and Pyrrhus, spent his last days. When I look at his villa, for it is not far from my own, I can never enough admire the man's own frugality or the spirit of the age. As Curius was sitting at his hearth, the Samnites, who brought him a large sum of gold, were repulsed by him. For it was not, he said, a fine thing in his eyes to possess gold, but to rule those who possessed it. Could such a high spirit fail to make old age pleasant? But to return to farmers, not to wander far from my own métier, in those days there were senators, that is, old men on their farms. For Cincinnatus was actually at the plough when word was brought to him that he had been named dictator. It was by his order as dictator, by the way, that Ahala, the master of the horse, seized and put to death Maelus when attempting to obtain royal power. Curius, as well as other old men, used to receive their summonses to attend the Senate in their farmhouses, from which circumstances the summoners were called viatares, or travelers. Was this men's old age an object of pity who found their pleasure in the cultivation of the land? In my opinion, scarcely any life could be more blessed. Not alone from its utility, for agriculture is beneficial to the whole human race, but also as much from the mere pleasure of the thing, to which I have already alluded, and from the rich abundance and supply of all things necessary for the food of man and for the worship of the gods above. So, as these are objects of desire to certain people, let us make our peace with pleasure. For the good and hard-working farmer's wine cellar and oil store, as well as his larder, are always well filled, and his whole farmhouse is richly furnished. It abounds in pigs, goats, lambs, fowls, milk, cheese, and honey. Then there is the garden, which the farmers themselves call their second flitch. A zest and flavor is added to all these by hunting and fowling in spare hours. Need I mention the greenery of meadows, the rows of trees, the beauty of the vineyard and olive grove? I will but put it briefly. Nothing can either furnish necessities more richly or present a fairer spectacle than well-cultivated land. And to the enjoyment of that, old age does not merely present no hindrance. It actually invites and allures to it. For where else can it better warm itself, either by basking in the sun, or by sitting by the fire, or at the proper time cool itself more wholesomely by the help of shade and water? Let the young keep their arms then to themselves, their horses' spears, their foils and ball, their swimming baths and running path. To us old men, let them, out of the many forms of sport, leave dice and counters. But even that, as they choose, since old age can be quite happy without them. Xenophon's books are very useful for many purposes. Pray go on reading them with attention, as you have ever done. In what ample terms is agriculture lauded by him in the book about husbanding one's property, which is called Economics. But to show you that he thought nothing so worthy of a prince as the taste for cultivating the soil, I will translate what Socrates says to Critobulus in that book. When that most gallant Lacedaemonian Lysander came to visit the Persian prince Cyrus at Sardis, so eminent for his character and the glory of his rule, bringing him presents from his allies, he treated Lysander in all ways with courteous familiarity and kindness, and, among other things, took him to see a certain park carefully planted. Lysander expressed admiration of the height of the trees and the exact arrangement of the rows in the quincunx, the careful cultivation of the soil, its freedom from weeds, and the sweetness of the odors exhaled from the flowers, and went on to say that what he admired was not the industry only, but also the skill of the man by whom this had been planned and laid out. Cyrus replied, "Well, it was I who planted the whole thing. These rows are my doing, and laying out is all mine. Many of the trees were even planted by my own hand." Then Lysander, looking at his purple robe, the brilliance of his person, and the adornment Persian fashion with gold and many jewels, said, "People are quite right, Cyrus, to call you happy, since the advantages of high fortune have been joined to an excellence like yours." This kind of good fortune, then, it is in the power of old men to enjoy. Nor is age any bar to our maintaining pursuits of every other kind, and especially of agriculture, to the very extreme verge of old age. For instance, we have it on record that Valerius Corvus kept it up to his 100th year, living on his land and cultivating after his active career was over, though between his first and sixth consulships there was an interval of 46 years. So that he had an official career lasting the number of years which our ancestors defined as coming between birth and the beginning of old age. Moreover, that last period of his old age was more blessed than that of his middle life, inasmuch as he had greater influence and less labor. For the crowning grace of old age is influence. How great was that of Celius Metellus? How great that of Attilus Calatinus, over whom the famous epitaph was placed? Very many classes agree in deeming this to have been the very first man of the nation. The line cut on his tomb is well known. It is natural, then, that a man should have had influence, in whose praise the verdict of history is unanimous. Again, in recent times, what a great man was Publius Crassus, Pontifex Maximus, and his successor in the same office, M. Lepidus. I need scarcely mention Paulus or Africanus, or as I did before Maximus. It was not only their senatorial utterances that had weight. Their least gesture had it also. In fact, old age, especially when it has enjoyed honors, has an influence worth all the pleasures of youth put together. But throughout my discourse, remember that my panegyric applies to an old age that has been established on foundations laid by youth, from which may be deduced what I once said with universal applause, that it was a wretched old age that had to defend itself by speech. Neither white hairs nor wrinkles can at once claim influence in themselves. It is the honorable conduct of earlier days that is rewarded by possessing influence at the last. Even things generally regarded as trifling in matters of course, being saluted, being courted, having way made for one, people rising when one approaches, being escorted to and from the forum, being referred to for advice, all these are marks of respect, observed among us and in other states, always most sedulously where the moral tone is highest. They say that Lysander the Spartan, whom I mentioned before, used to remark that Sparta was the most dignified home for old age, for that nowhere was more respect paid to years, nowhere was old age held in higher honor. Nay, the story is told of how when a man advanced in years came into the theater at Athens, when the games were going on, no place was given him anywhere in that large assembly by his own countrymen. But when he came near the Lacedaemonians, who as ambassadors had a fixed place assigned to them, they rose as one man out of respect for him and gave the veteran a seat. When they were greeted with rounds of applause from the whole audience, one of them remarked, "The Athenians know what is right, but will not do it." There are many excellent rules in our augural college, but among the best is one which affects our subject, that precedence in speech goes by seniority, and augurs who are older are preferred not only to those who have held higher office, but even to those who are actually in possession of imperium. What, then, are the physical pleasures to be compared with the reward of influence? Those who have employed it with distinction appear to me have played the drama of life to its end, and not to have broken down in the last act like unpracticed players. But, it will be said, old men are fretful, fidgety, ill-tempered, and disagreeable. If you come to that, they are also avaricious. But these are faults of character, not of the time of life. And, after all, fretfulness and the other faults I mentioned admits of some excuse, not indeed a complete one, but one that may possibly pass muster. They think themselves neglected, looked down upon, mocked. Besides, with bodily weakness every rub is a source of pain. Yet all these faults are softened by both good character and good education. Illustrations of this may be found in real life, as also on the stage in the case of the brothers in the Delphi. What harshness in the one, what gracious manners in the other. The fact is that, just as it is not every wine, so it is not every life that turns sour from keeping. Serious gravity I approve of in old age, but, as in other things, it must be within due limits. Bitterness I can in no case approve. What the object of senile avarice may be I cannot conceive, for can there be anything more absurd than to seek more journey money, the less there remains of the journey? There remains the fourth reason, which more than anything else appears to torment men of my age and keep them in a flutter. The nearness of death, which it must be allowed cannot be far from an old man. But what a poor dotard must he be who has not learnt in the course of so long a life that death is not a thing to be feared. Death, that is either to be totally disregarded, if it entirely extinguishes the soul, or is even to be desired if it brings him where he is to exist forever. The third alternative, at any rate, cannot possibly be discovered. Why then should I be afraid if I am destined either not to be miserable after death, or even to be happy? After all, who was such a fool as to feel certain, however young he may be, that he will be alive in the evening? Nay, that time of life has many more chances of death than ours. Young men more easily contract diseases, their illnesses are more serious, their treatment has to be more severe. Accordingly, only a few arrive at old age. If that were not so, life would be conducted better and more wisely. For it is in old men that thought, reason, and prudence are to be found. And if there had been no old men, states would never have existed at all. But I return to the subject of the imminence of death. What sort of charge is this against old age, when you see that it is shared by youth? I had reason, in the case of my excellent son, as you had, Scipio, in that of your brothers, who were expected to attain the highest honors, to realize that death is common to every time of life. Yes, you will say, but a young man expects to live long. An old man cannot expect to do so. Well, he is a fool to expect it. For what can be more foolish than to regard the uncertain as certain, the false as true? An old man has nothing even to hope. Ah, but it is just there that he is in a better position than a young man, since what the latter only hopes he has obtained. The one wishes to live long, the other has lived long. And yet, good heavens, what is long in a man's life? For grant the utmost limit, let us expect an age like that of the king of Tartessi. For there was, as I find recorded, a certain Agonius at Gades who reigned 80 years and lived 120. But to my mind, nothing seems even long in which there is any last, for when that arrives, then all the past has slipped away. Only that remains to which you have attained by virtue and righteous actions. Hours indeed, and days, and months, and years depart, nor does past time ever return, nor can the future be known. Whatever time each is granted for life, with that he is bound to be content. An actor, in order to earn approval, is not bound to perform a play from the beginning to end. Let him only satisfy the audience of whatever act he appears. Nor need a wise man go on to the concluding plaudite. For a short term of life is long enough for living well and honorably. But if you go farther, you have no more right to grumble than farmers do because the charm of the spring season is past and the summer and autumn have come. For the word spring in a way suggests youth, and points to the harvest to be. The other seasons are suited for the reaping and storing of the crops. Now the harvest of old age is, as I have often said, the memory and rich store of blessings laid up in earlier life. Again, all things that accord with nature are to be counted as good. But what can be more in accordance with nature than for old men to die? A thing indeed which also befalls young men, though nature revolts and fights against it. Accordingly, the death of young men seems to me like putting out a great fire with a deluge of water. But old men die like a fire going out because it is burnt down of its own nature without artificial means. Again, just as apples when unripe are torn from trees, but when ripe and mellow drop down, so it is violence that takes the life from young men, ripeness from old. This ripeness is so delightful to me that, as I approach nearer to death, I seem, as it were, to be sighting land, and to be coming to port at last after a long voyage. Again, there is no fixed borderline for old age, and you are making a good and proper use of it as long as you can satisfy the call of duty and disregard death. The result of this is that old age is even more confident and courageous than youth. That is the meaning of Solon's answer to the Tyrus Pisistratus. When the latter asked him what he relied upon in opposing him with such boldness, he is said to have replied, "On my old age." But that end of life is the best when, without the intellect or senses being impaired, nature herself takes to pieces her own handiwork, which she also put together. Just as the builder of a ship or a house can break them up more easily than anyone else, so the nature that knit together the human frame can also best unfasten it. Moreover, a thing freshly glued together is always difficult to pull asunder. If old, this is easily done. The result is that the short time of life left to them is not to be grasped at by old men with greedy eagerness, or abandoned without cause. Pythagoras forbids us, without an order from our commander, that is God, to desert life fortress and outpost. Solon's epitaph indeed is that of a wise man, in which he says that he does not wish his death to be unaccompanied by the sorrow of lamentations of friends. He wants, I suppose, to be beloved by them. But I rather think Ennius says it better. None grace me with their tears, nor weeping loud, make sad my funeral rites. He holds that a death is not a subject for mourning, when it is followed by immortality. Again, there may possibly be some sensation of dying, and that only for a short time, especially in the case of an old man. After death, indeed, Sensation is either what one would desire, or it disappears altogether. But to disregard death is a lesson which must be studied from our youth up, for unless that is learnt, no one can have a quiet mind. For die we certainly must, and that too without being certain whether it may not be at this very day. A death, therefore, is hanging over our head every hour. How can a man ever be unshaken in soul if he fears it? But on this theme, I don't think I need much enlarge. When I remember what Lucius Brutus did, who was killed while defending his country, or the two Decii, who spurred their horses to a gallop and met a voluntary death, or Attilius Regulus, who left his home to confront a death of torture, rather than break the word which he had pledged to the enemy, or the two Scipios, who determined to block the Carthaginian advance even with their own bodies, or your grandfather, Lucius Paulus, who paid with his life for the rashness of his colleagues in the disgrace at Cannae, or Marcellus, whose death not even the most bloodthirsty of enemies would allow to go without the honor of burial. It is enough to recall that our legions, as I've recorded in my Origins, have often marched with cheerful and lofty spirit to ground from which they believed they would never return. That, therefore, which young men, not only uninstructed but absolutely ignorant, treat as of no account, shall men who are neither young nor ignorant shrink from in terror? As a general truth, as it seems to me, it is weariness of all pursuits that creates weariness of life. There are certain pursuits adapted to childhood. Do young men miss them? There are others suited to early manhood. Does that settled time of life called middle age ask for them? There are others again suited to that age, but not looked for in old age. There are, finally, some which belong to old age. Therefore, as the pursuit of the earlier ages have their time for disappearing, so also those of old age, and when that takes place, satiety of life brings on the ripe time for death. For I do not see why I should not venture to tell you my personal opinion as to death, of which I seem myself to have a clearer vision in proportion as I am nearer to it. I believe, Scipio and Laelius, that your fathers, those illustrious men and my dearest friends, are still alive, and that too with a life which alone deserves the name. For as long as we are imprisoned in this framework of the body, we perform a certain function and laborious work assigned us by fate. The soul, in fact, is of heavenly origin, forced down from its home in the highest, and, so to speak, buried in earth, a place quite opposed to its divine nature and its immortality. But I suppose the immortal gods to have sown souls broadcast in human bodies, that there might be some to survey the world, and while contemplating the order of the heavenly bodies to imitate it in the unvarying regularity of their life. Nor is it only reason and arguments that have brought me to this belief, but the great fame and authority of the most distinguished philosophers. I used to be told that Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, almost natives of our country, who in old times had been called the Italian school of philosophers, never doubted that we had souls drafted from the universal divine intelligence. I used besides to have pointed out to me the discourse delivered by Socrates on the last day of his life upon the immortality of the soul. Socrates, who was pronounced by the oracle at Delphi to be the wisest of men. I need say no more. I have convinced myself, and I hold, in the view of the rapid movement of the soul, its vivid memory of the past and its prophetic knowledge of the future, its many accomplishments, its vast range of knowledge, its numerous discoveries, that a nature embracing such varied gifts cannot itself be mortal. And since the soul is always in motion, and yet has no external source of motion, for it is self-moved, I conclude again that it will also have no end to its motion, because it is not likely ever to abandon itself. Again, since the nature of the soul is not composite, nor has in it any admixture that is not homogeneous and similar, I conclude that it is indivisible, and, if indivisible, that it cannot perish. It is again a strong proof of men knowing most things before birth, that when mere children they grasp innumerable facts with such speed as to show that they are not then taking them in for the first time, but remembering and recalling them. This is roughly Plato's argument. Once more in Xenophon we have the elder Cyrus on his deathbed speaking as follows. Do not suppose, my dearest sons, that when I have left you I shall be nowhere and no one. Even when I was with you, you did not see my soul, but knew it was in this body of mine from what I did. Believe, then, that it is still the same, even though you see it not. The honors paid to illustrious men had not continued to exist after their death. Had the souls of these very men not done something to make us retain our recollection of them beyond the ordinary time? For myself, I never could be persuaded that soul while in mortal bodies were alive and died directly they left them, nor in fact that the soul only lost all intelligence when it left the unintelligent body. I believe rather than when, by being liberated from all corporeal admixture, it has begun to be pure and undefiled, it is then that it becomes wise. And again, when a man's natural frame is resolved into its elements by death, it is clearly seen whither each of the other elements departs. For they all go to the place from which they came, but the soul alone is invisible alike when present and when departing. Once more, you see that nothing is so like death as sleep, and yet it is in sleepers that souls most clearly revive in their divine nature, for they foresee many events when they are allowed to escape and are left free. This shows what they are likely to be when they have completely freed themselves from the fetters of body. Wherefore, if these things are so, obey me as a god. But if my soul is to perish with my body, nevertheless do you, from awe of the gods, who guard and govern this fair universe, preserve my memory by the loyalty and piety of your lives. Such are the words of the dying Cyrus. I will now, with your good leave, look at home. No one, my dear Scipio, shall ever persuade me that your father, Paulus, and your two grandfathers, Paulus and Africanus, or the father of Africanus, or his uncle, or many other illustrious men not necessary to mention, would have attempted such lofty deeds as to be remembered by posterity, had they not seen in their minds that the future ages concerned them. Do you suppose, to take an old man privilege of little self-praise, that I should have been likely to undertake such heavy labors by day and night, at home and abroad, if I had been destined to have the same limit to my glory as to my life? Had it not been much better to pass an age of ease and repose without any labor or exertion? But my soul, I know not how, refusing to be kept down, ever fixed its eyes upon future ages, as though from a conviction that it would begin to live only when it had left the body. But had it not been cast that souls were immortal, it would not have been the souls of all the best men that made the greatest efforts after an immortality of fame. Again, is there not the fact that the wisest man ever dies with the greatest cheerfulness, and the most unwise with the least? Don't you think that the soul which has the clearer and longer sight sees that it is starting for better things, while the soul whose vision is dimmer does not see it? For my part, I am transported with the desire to see your fathers, who are the object of my reverence and affection. Nor is it only those whom I knew that I long to see. It is those also of whom I have been told and have read, whom I have myself recorded in my history. When I am setting out for that, there is certainly no one who will find it easy to draw me back, or boil me up again like second Pelios. Nay, if some god should grant me to renew my childhood from my present age and once more to be crying in my cradle, I would firmly refuse. Nor should I be in truth willing, after having, as it were, run the full course, to be recalled from the winning crease to the barriers. For what blessings has life to offer? Should we not rather say what labor? But granting that it has, at any rate it has after all a limit either to enjoyment or to existence. I don't wish to depreciate life, as many men and good philosophers have often done, nor do I regret having lived, for I have done so in a way that lets me think that I was not born in vain. But I quit life as I would an inn, not as I would a home. For nature has given us a place of entertainment, not of residence. O glorious day, when I shall set out to join that heavenly conclave and company of souls, and depart from the turmoil and purities of this world. For I shall not go to join only those who I have before mentioned, but also my son Cato, than whom no better man was never born, nor one more conspicuous for piety. His body was burnt by me, though mine ought, on the contrary, to have been burnt by him. But his spirit, not abandoning, but ever looking back upon me, has certainly gone whither he saw that I too must come. I was thought to bear that loss heroically. Not that I really bore it without distress, but I found my own consolation in the thought that the parting and separation between us was not to be for long. It is by these means, my dear Scipio, for you said that you and Lady Lace were wont to express surprise on this point, that my old age sits lightly on me, and is not only not oppressive, but even delightful. But if I am wrong in thinking the human soul immortal, I am glad to be wrong. Nor will I allow the mistake which gives me so much pleasure to be wrested from me as long as I live. But if when dead, As some insignificant philosophers think I am to be without sensation, I am not afraid of dead philosophers deriding my errors. Again, if we are not to be immortal, it is nevertheless what a man must wish, to have his life end at the proper time. For nature puts a limit to living, as to everything else. Now, old age is, as it were, the playing out of the drama, the full fatigue of which we should shun, especially when we also feel that we have had more than enough of it. This is all I had to say on old age. I pray that you may arrive at it, that you may put my words to a practical test. End of On Old Age by Cicero. Read by M.L. Cohen, mojomove411.com, that's MOJOMOVE 411.com, Cleveland, Ohio, September 2007.
On the Unjust Causes of War by Hugo Grotius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. On the Unjust Causes of War by Hugo Grotius, or Hugo de Groot. Chapter 22 from The Rights of War and Peace, published in 1625. Translated by A.C. Campbell, 1901. In a former part of this work, where the justice of war was discussed, it was observed that some wars were founded upon real motives, and others only upon colorable pretexts. This distinction was first noticed by Polybius, who calls the pretexts prophases and the real causes aetias. Thus Alexander made war upon Darius under the pretence of avenging the former wrongs done by the Persians to the Greeks. But the real motive of that bold and enterprising hero was the easy acquisition of wealth and dominion, which the expeditions of Xenophon and Agesilaus had opened to his view. In the same manner, a dispute about Saguntum furnished the Carthaginians with colorable motives for the Second Punic War, but in reality they could not brook the indignity of having consented to a treaty which the Romans had extorted from them at an unfavourable moment, and more especially as their spirits were revived by their recent successes in Spain. The real causes assigned by Thucydides for the Peloponnesian War were the jealousies entertained by the Lacedaemonians of the then growing power of the Athenians, though the quarrels of the Corcyraeans, Potidines, and other secondary states were made the ostensible reasons. There are some who have neither ostensible reasons nor just causes to plead for their hostilities, in which, as Tacitus says, they engage from the pure love of enterprise and danger, a disposition to which Aristotle gives the name of ferocity, and in the last book of his Nicomachean Ethics he calls it a bloody cruelty to convert friends into enemies whom you may slaughter. Though most powers, when engaging in war, are desirous to colour over their real motives with justifiable pretexts, yet some, totally disregarding such methods of vindication, seem able to give no better reason for their conduct than what is told by the Roman lawyers of a robber, who, being asked what right he had to a thing which he had seized, replied it was his own, because he had taken it into his possession. Aristotle, in the 3rd book of his Rhetoric, speaking of the promoters of war, asks if it is not unjust for a neighbouring people to be enslaved, and if those promoters have no regard to the rights of unoffending nations. Cicero, in the 1st book of his Offices, speaks in the same strain, and calls the courage which is conspicuous in danger and enterprise, if devoid of justice, absolutely undeserving of the name of valour. It should rather be considered as a brutal fierceness outraging every principle of humanity. Others make use of pretexts which, though plausible at first sight, will not bear the examination and test of moral rectitude, and, when stripped of their disguise, such pretexts will be found fraught with injustice. In such hostilities, says Livy, it is not a trial of right, but some object of secret and unruly ambition, which acts as the chief spring. Most powers, it is said by Plutarch, employ the relative situations of peace and war as a current specie for the purchase of whatever they deem expedient. By having before examined and established the principles of just and necessary war, we may form a better idea of what goes to constitute the injustice of the same, as the nature of things is best seen by contrast, and we judge of what is crooked by comparing it with what is straight. But for the sake of perspicuity, it will be necessary to treat upon the leading points. It was shewn above that apprehensions from a neighbouring power are not a sufficient ground for war. For to authorize hostilities as a defensive measure, they must arise from the necessity which just apprehensions create, apprehensions not only of the power, but of the intentions of a formidable state, and such apprehensions as amount to a moral certainty. For which reason the opinion of those is by no means to be approved of who lay down as a just ground of war the construction of fortifications in a neighbouring country, with whom there is no existing treaty to prohibit such constructions, or the securing of a stronghold which may at some future period prove a means of annoyance. For, as a guard against such apprehensions, every power may construct in its own territory strong works and other military securities of the same kind, without having recourse to actual war. One cannot but admire the character which Tacitus has drawn of the Cauci, a noble and high-spirited people of Germany, who, he says, were desirous of maintaining their greatness by justice rather than by acts of ungovernable rapacity and ambition, provoking no wars, invading no countries, spoiling no neighbours to aggrandize themselves, yet, when necessity prompted, able to raise men with arms in their hands at a moment's warning, a great population with a numerous breed of horses to form a well-mounted cavalry, and, with all these advantages, upholding their reputation in the midst of peace. Nor can the advantage to be gained by a war be ever pleaded as a motive of equal weight and justice with necessity. Neither can the desire of emigrating to a more favourable soil and climate justify an attack upon a neighbouring power. This, as we are informed by Tacitus, was a frequent cause of war among the ancient Germans. There is no less injustice in setting up claims under the pretence of newly discovered titles to what belongs to another. Neither can the wickedness and impiety, nor any other incapacity of the original owner justify such a claim, for the title and right by discovery can apply only to countries and places that have no owner. Neither moral nor religious virtue, nor any intellectual excellence is requisite to form a good title to property. Only where a race of men is so destitute of reason as to be incapable of exercising any act of ownership, they can hold no property, nor will the law of charity require that they should have more than the necessaries of life. For the rules of the law of nations can only be applied to those who are capable of political or commercial intercourse, but not to a people entirely destitute of reason, though it is a matter of just doubt whether any such is to be found. It was an absurdity, therefore, in the Greeks to suppose that difference of manners or inferiority of intellect made those whom they were pleased to call barbarians their natural enemies. But as to atrocious crimes striking at the very root and existence of society, the forfeiture of property ensuing from thence is a question of a different nature, belonging to punishments, under the head of which it was discussed. But neither the independence of individuals nor that of states is a motive that can at all times justify recourse to arms, as if all persons indiscriminately had a natural right to do so. For where liberty is said to be a natural right belonging to all men and states, by that expression is understood a right of nature, antecedent to every human obligation or contract. But in that case liberty is spoken of in a negative sense, and not by way of contrast to independence, the meaning of which is that no one is by the law of nature doomed to servitude, though he is not forbidden by that law to enter into such a condition. For in this sense no one can be called free if nature leaves him not the privilege of choosing his own condition. As Albusius pertinently remarks, the terms freedom and servitude are not founded in the principles of nature, but are names subsequently applied to men according to the dispositions of fortune. And Aristotle defines the relations of master and servant to be the result of political and not of natural appointment. Whenever, therefore, the condition of servitude, either personal or political, subsists from lawful causes, man should be contented with that state, according to the injunction of the Apostle, Art thou called being a servant? Let not that be an anxious concern. And there is equal injustice in the desire of reducing, by force of arms, any people to a state of servitude, under the pretext of its being the condition for which they are best qualified by nature. It does not follow that, because any one is fitted for a particular condition, another has a right to impose it upon him. For every reasonable creature ought to be left free in the choice of what may be deemed useful or prejudicial to him, provided another has no just right to a control over him. The case of children has no connection with the question, as they are necessarily under the discipline of others. It would scarcely have been necessary to refute the foolish opinion of some who have ascribed to the Roman emperors dominion over the most remote and unknown nations, if Bartolus, deemed a lawyer of the first eminence, had not pronounced it heresy to deny those pretensions. This opinion has been built upon the Roman emperors sometimes having styled himself sovereign of the whole world, a term which it was not unusual for many people to apply to their own country. Thus in the Scriptures we find Judea frequently called the whole inhabited earth. Therefore, when the Jews, in their proverbial expression, called Jerusalem the centre of the world, nothing more is to be implied than that it was situated in the middle of Judea. As to the argument in favour of universal dominion from its being so beneficial to mankind, it may be observed that all its advantages are counterbalanced by still greater disadvantages. For as a ship may be built too large to be conveniently managed, so an empire may be too extensive in population and territory to be directed and governed by one head. But granting the expediency of universal empire, that expediency cannot give such a right as can be acquired only by treaty or conquest. There were many places formerly belonging to the Roman Empire, over which the emperor has at present no control. For war, treaty, or cession have made many changes, by which the rights of territory have passed to other states or sovereign princes, and the standards of different communities, whether kingdoms or commonwealths, now wave in places which the Roman eagle once overshadowed with his wings. These are losses and changes that have been experienced by other powers no less than that which was once mistress of the world. But there have been some who have asserted the rights of the Church over unknown parts of the world, though the Apostle Paul himself has expressly said that Christians were not to judge those who were without the pale of their own community. And though the right of judging which belonged to the Apostles might in some cases apply to worldly concerns, yet in its general nature it was of a celestial rather than an earthly kind, a judgment not exercised by fire and sword, but by the word of God, proposed to all men and adapted to their peculiar circumstances, a judgment exercised by displaying or withholding the seals of divine grace, as it might be most expedient. Lastly, it was a judgment exercised in supernatural punishments, in punishments proceeding from God, like the punishments of Ananias, Elymas, Hymenaeus, and others. Christ himself, the spring from whence all the power of the Church was derived, and whose life is the model for the Church to follow, said his kingdom was not of this world, that is, was not of the same nature with other kingdoms. Otherwise, like the rest of sovereigns, he would have maintained his authority by the power of the sword. For if he had pleased to call up the aid of legions, he would have called up hosts of angels and not of men. And every exercise of his right was performed by the influence of divine and not of human power, even when he drove the sellers out of the temple. For the rod was the emblem and not the instrument of the divine wrath, as unction was once a sign of healing and not the healing power itself. St. Augustine, on the 18th chapter of St. John, and 36th verse, invites sovereign princes into this kingdom in these terms, quote, "Hear, O Jews and Gentiles, hear, O earthly sovereigns, I will not obstruct your authority, for my kingdom is not of this world. Be not alarmed like Herod, who trembled when he heard that Christ was born, and slew so many innocent children, hoping to include the Saviour in that calamity. His fear shewed itself in cruel wrath. But my kingdom, says Christ, is not of this world. Therefore enter this kingdom without fear. Come with faith, and provoke not the king to anger by your delay." End of quote. There is a caution too necessary to be given against drawing too close a parallel between ancient and modern times, for it is but seldom that any one can adduce a case exactly conformable to his own circumstances. To draw such pretexts from the interpretation of prophecy is the highest presumption, for no prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled can be unfolded without the aid of a prophetic spirit. The times even of events that are certain may escape our notice. Nor is it every prediction, unless it be accompanied with an express command from God, that can justify recourse to arms. Sometimes, indeed, God brings his predicted designs to their issue by the means of wicked instruments. As the imperfect obligations of charity, and other virtues of the same kind, are not cognizable in a court of justice, so neither can the performance of them be compelled by force of arms. For it is not the moral nature of a duty that can enforce its fulfilment, but there must be some legal right in one of the parties to exact the obligation. For the moral obligation receives an additional weight from such a right. This obligation therefore must be united to the former to give a war the character of a just war. Thus a person who has conferred a favour has not, strictly speaking, a right to demand a return, for that would be converting an act of kindness into a contract. It is necessary to observe that a war may be just in its origin, and yet the intentions of its authors may become unjust in the course of its prosecution, for some other motive, not unlawful in itself, may actuate them more powerfully than the original right, for the attainment of which the war was begun. It is laudable, for instance, to maintain national honour. It is laudable to pursue a public or a private interest, and yet those objects may not form the justifiable grounds of the war in question. A war may gradually change its nature and its object from the prosecution of a right to the desire of seconding or supporting the aggrandizement of some other power. But such motives, though blamable, when even connected with a just war, do not render the war itself unjust, nor invalidate its conquests. End of On the Unjust Causes of War by Hugo Grotius. This recording is in the public domain.
The Sacredness of Work by Thomas Carlyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sacredness of Work. All true work is sacred. In all true hand labor, there is something of divineness. Labor, wide as the earth, has its summit in heaven. Sweat of the brow, and up from that to sweat of the brain, sweat of the heart, which includes all Kepler's calculations, Newton's meditations, all sciences, all spoken epics, all acted heroism, martyrdoms, up to that agony of bloody sweat, which all men have called divine. O brother, if this is not worship, then I say, the more pity for worship. For this is the noblest thing yet discovered under God's sky. Who art thou that complainest of thy life of toil? Complain not. Look up, my wearied brother. See thy fellow workmen there, in God's eternity, surviving there, they alone surviving. Sacred band of the immortals, celestial bodyguard of the empire of mind. Even in the weak human memory they survive so long as saints, as heroes, as gods. They alone surviving, peopling the immeasured solitudes of time. To thee, heaven, though severe, is not unkind. Heaven is kind as a noble mother, as that Spartan mother saying, while she gave her son his shield, quote, "With it, my son," or "upon it," end quote. Thou too shalt return home in honor to thy far distant home, doubt it not, if in the battle thou keep thy shield. End of The Sacredness of Work by Thomas Carlyle. Recording by Robert Scott, mojomove411.com, mojomove411.com. September the 13th, 2007. Secession by Alexander H. Stevens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Secession. Mr. President, this step of secession once taken can never be recalled, and all the baleful and withering consequences that must follow will rest on the convention for all coming time. When we and our posterity shall see our lovely South desolated by the demon of war, which this act of yours will inevitably invite and call forth, when our green fields of waving harvest shall be trodden down by the murderous soldiery and fiery car of war, sweeping over our land, our temples of justice laid in ashes, all the horrors and desolation of war upon us. Who but this convention will be held responsible for it? Who but him who shall have given his vote for the unwise and ill-timed measure, as I honestly think and believe, shall be held to strict account for this suicidal act by the present generation, and probably cursed and execrated by posterity for all coming time, for the wide and desolating ruin that will inevitably follow this act you now propose to perpetrate. Pause, I entreat you, and consider for a moment what reasons you can give that will even satisfy yourselves in calmer moments. What reason you can give to your fellow sufferers in the calamity that it will bring upon us. What reason can you give the nations of the earth to justify it? They will be the calm and deliberate judges in this case. And what cause or one overt act can you name or point on which to rest the plea of justification? What right has the North assailed? What interest of the South has been invaded? What justice has been denied? And what claim founded in justice and right has been withheld? Can either of you today name one governmental act of wrong deliberately and purposely done by the government of Washington, of which the South has a right to complain? I challenge the answer, while on the other hand let me show the facts, of which I wish you to judge, and I will only state the facts, which are clear and undeniable, and which now stand as records authentic in the history of our country. When we of the South demanded the slave trade, or the importation of Africans for the cultivation of our lands, did they not yield the right for 20 years? When we asked a 3/5 representation in Congress for our slaves, was it not granted? When we asked and demanded the return of any fugitive from justice, or the recovery of those persons owing labor or allegiance, was it not incorporated in the Constitution, and again ratified and strengthened by the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850? But do you reply that in many instances they have violated this compact and have not been faithful to their engagements? As individual and local communities, they may have done so, but not by the sanction of government, for that has always been true to Southern interests. Again, gentlemen, look at another act. When we have asked that more territory should be added that we might spread the institution of slavery, have they not yielded to our demands in giving us Louisiana, Florida, and Texas? From these 4 states have been carved, and ample territory for 4 more is to be added in due time. If you, by this unwise and impolitic act, do not destroy this hope, and perhaps by it lose all, and have your last slave wrenched from you by stern military rule, as South America and Mexico were, or by the vindictive decree of a universal emancipation which may reasonably be expected to follow. But again, gentlemen, what have we to gain by this proposed change of our relation to the general government? We have always had the control of it, and can yet, if we remain in it, and are as united as we have been. We have had a majority of the presidents chosen from the South, as well as the control and management of most of those chosen from the North. We have had 60 years of Southern presidents to their 24, thus controlling the executive department. So of the judges of the Supreme Court, we have had 18 from the South and but 11 from the North. Although nearly 4/5 of the judicial business has arisen in the free states, yet a majority of the court has always been from the South. This we have required so as to guard against any interpretation of the Constitution unfavorable to us. In like manner, we have been equally watchful to guard our interests in the legislative branch of government. In choosing the presidents of the Senate, we have had 24 to their 11. Speakers of the House, we have had 23 and they 12, while the majority of the representatives from the greater population have always been from the North. Yet we have generally secured the Speaker, because he, to a great extent, shapes and controls the legislation of the country. nor have we had less control in every other department of the general government. Attorney generals we have had 14, while the North have had but 5. Foreign ministers we have had 86, and they but 54. While 3/4 of the business which demands diplomatic agents abroad is clearly from the free states, from their greater commercial interest. Yet we have had the principal embassies, so as to secure the world markets for our cotton, tobacco, and sugar on the best possible terms. We have had a vast majority of the higher offices of both Army and Navy, while a larger proportion of the soldiers and sailors were drawn from the North. Again, from official documents, we learn that a fraction over 3/4 of the revenue collected for the support of the government has uniformly been raised from the North. Leaving out of view, for the present, the countless millions of dollars you must expend in a war with the North, with tens of thousands of your sons and brothers slain in battle and offered up as sacrifices upon the altar of your ambition. And for what? We ask again. Is it for the overthrow of the American government established by our common ancestry, cemented and built up by their sweat and blood, and founded on the principles of right, justice, and humanity? And as such I must declare here, as I have often done before, and which has been repeated by the greatest and wisest of statesmen and patriots in this and other lands, that it is the best and freest government, the most equal in its rights, the most just in its decisions, the most lenient in its measures, and the most aspiring in its principles, to elevate the race of men that the Son of Heaven ever shone upon. Now for you to attempt to overthrow such a government as this, under which we have lived for more than 3/4 of a century, in which we have gained our wealth, our standing as a nation, our domestic safety, while the elements of peril are around us, with peace and tranquility accompanied with unbounded prosperity and rights unassailed, is the height of madness, folly, and wickedness, to which I neither lend my sanction nor my vote. Footnote: delivered at the Georgia State Convention, January 1861. End footnote. Recording by Robert Scott, mojomove411.com, MOJOMOVE411.com. September the 18th, 2007.
Selections from Chocolate and Cocoa Recipes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Selections from Chocolate and Cocoa Recipes by Miss Maria Parloa, specially prepared for Walter Baker and Company, Limited. Cocoa and chocolate. The term cocoa, a corruption of cacao, is almost universally used in English-speaking countries to designate the seeds of the small tropical tree known to botanists as Theobroma cacao, from which a great variety of preparations under the name of cocoa and chocolate for eating and drinking are made. The name chocolatl is nearly the same in most European languages, and is taken from the Mexican name of the drink, chocolate, or cacahuatl. The Spaniards found chocolate in common use among the Mexicans at the time of the invasion under Cortes in 1519, and it was introduced into Spain immediately after. The Mexicans not only used chocolate as a staple article of food, but they used the seeds of the cacao tree as a medium of exchange. No better evidence could be offered of the great advance which has been made in recent years in the knowledge of dietetics than the remarkable increase in the consumption of cocoa and chocolate in this country. The amount retained for home consumption in 1860 was only 1,181,054 pounds, about 3/5 of an ounce for each inhabitant. The amount retained for home consumption for the year ending December 31st, 1908, was 93,956,721 pounds, over 16 ounces for each inhabitant. Although there was a marked increase in the consumption of tea and coffee during the same period, the ratio of increase fell far below that of cocoa. It is evident that the coming American is going to be less of a tea and coffee drinker and more of a cocoa and chocolate drinker. This is the natural result of a better knowledge of the laws of health, and of the food value of a beverage which nourishes the body while it also stimulates the brain. Baron von Liebig, one of the best-known writers on dietetics, says, "It is a perfect food, as wholesome as delicious, a beneficent restorer of exhausted power, but its quality must be good, and it must be carefully prepared. It is highly nourishing and easily digested, and is fitted to repair wasted strength, preserve health, and prolong life. It agrees with dry temperaments and convalescents, with mothers who nurse their children, with those whose occupations oblige them to undergo severe mental strains, with public speakers, and with all those who give to work a portion of the time needed for sleep. It soothes both stomach and brain, and for this reason, as well as for others, it is the best friend of those engaged in literary pursuits." Monsieur Brillat-Savarin, in his entertaining and valuable work, Physiologie du Gout, says, "Chocolate came over the mountains, from Spain to France, with Anne of Austria, daughter of Philip III and Queen of Louis XIII. The Spanish monks also spread the knowledge of it by the presents they made to their brothers in France. It is well known that Linnaeus called the fruit of the cocoa tree, Theobroma, food for the gods. The cause of this emphatic qualification has been sought, and attributed by some to the fact that he was extravagantly fond of chocolate, by others to his desire to please his confessor, and by others to his gallantry, a queen having first introduced it into France. The Spanish ladies of the New World, it is said, carried their love for chocolate to such a degree that, not content with partaking of it several times a day, they had it sometimes carried after them to church. This flavoring of the senses often drew upon them the censures of the bishop, but the Reverend Father Escobar, whose metaphysics were as subtle as his morality was accommodating, declared formally that a fast was not broken by chocolate prepared with water, thus wire-drawing, in favor of his penitents, the ancient adage, liquidum non frangit jejunium. Time and experience, he says further, have shown that chocolate, carefully prepared, is an article of food as wholesome as it is agreeable, that it is nourishing, easy of digestion, and does not possess those qualities injurious to beauty with which coffee has been reproached, that it is excellently adapted to persons who are obliged to a great concentration of intellect in the toils of the pulpit or the bar, and especially to travellers, that it suits the most feeble stomach, that excellent effects have been produced by it in chronic complaints, and that it is a last resource in affections of the pylorus. Some persons complain of being unable to digest chocolate. Others, on the contrary, pretend that it is not sufficient nourishment, and that the effect disappears too soon. it is probable that the former have only themselves to blame, and that the chocolate which they use is of bad quality or badly made, for good and well-made chocolate must suit every stomach which retains the slightest digestive power. In regard to the others, the remedy is an easy one. They should reinforce their breakfast with a pâté, a cutlet, or a kidney. Moisten the whole with a good draught of Soconuso chocolate, and thank God for a stomach of such superior activity. This gives me an opportunity to make an observation whose accuracy may be depended upon. After a good, complete, and copious breakfast, if we take, in addition, a cup of well-made chocolate, digestion will be perfectly accomplished in 3 hours, and we may dine whenever we like. Out of zeal for science, and by dint of eloquence, I have induced many ladies to try this experiment. They all declared, in the beginning, that it would kill them, but they have all thriven on it, and have not failed to glorify their teacher. The people who make constant use of chocolate are the ones who enjoy the most steady health, and are the least subject to a multitude of little ailments which destroy the comfort of life. Their plumpness is also more equal. These are 2 advantages which every one may verify among his own friends, and wherever the practice is in use. In corroboration of Monsieur Brillat-Savarin's statement as to the value of chocolate as an aid to digestion, we may quote from one of Madame de Sévigne's letters to her daughter. I took chocolate night before last to digest my dinner in order to have a good supper. I took some yesterday for nourishment, so as to be able to fast until night. What I consider amusing about chocolate is that it acts according to the wishes of the one who takes it. Chocolate appears to have been highly valued as a remedial agent by the leading physicians of that day. Christoph Ludwig Hoffmann wrote a treatise entitled Potus Chocolate, in which he recommended it in many diseases, and instanced the case of Cardinal Richelieu, who, he stated, was cured of general atrophy by its use. A French officer who served in the West Indies for a period of 15 years, during the early part of the last century, wrote, as a result of his personal observations, a treatise on the natural history of chocolate, being a distinct and particular account of the cacao tree, its growth and culture, and the preparation, excellent properties, and medicinal virtues of its fruit, which received the approbation of the Regent of the Faculty of Medicine at Paris, and which was translated and published in London in 1730. After describing the different methods of raising and curing the fruit, and preparing it for food, which is not worth while to reproduce here, as the methods have essentially changed since that time, he goes on to demonstrate, as the result of actual experiment, that chocolate is a substance very temperate, very nourishing, and of easy digestion, very proper to repair the exhausted spirits and decayed strength, and very suitable to preserve the health and prolong the lives of old men. I could produce several instances, he says, in favor of this excellent nourishment, but I shall content myself with 2 only, equally certain and decisive in proof of its goodness. The first is an experiment of chocolates being taken for the only nourishment, made by a surgeon's wife of Martinico. She had lost, by a very deplorable accident, her lower jaw, which reduced her to such a condition that she did not know how to subsist. She was not capable of taking anything solid, and not rich enough to live upon jellies and nourishing broths. In this strait she determined to take 3 dishes of chocolate, prepared after the manner of the country, 1 in the morning, 1 at noon, and 1 at night. Their chocolate is nothing else but cocoa kernels dissolved in hot water, with sugar, and seasoned with a bit of cinnamon. This new way of life succeeded so well that she has lived a long while since, more lively and robust than before this accident. I had the second relation from a gentleman of Martinico, and one of my friends not capable of a falsity. He assured me that in his neighborhood an infant of 4 months old unfortunately lost his nurse, and its parents not being able to put it to another, resolved, through necessity, to feed it with chocolate. The success was very happy, for the infant came on to a miracle, and was neither less healthy nor less vigorous than those who are brought up by the best nurses. Before chocolate was known in Europe, good old wine was called the milk of old men. But this title is now applied with greater reason to chocolate. Since its use has become so common that it has been perceived that chocolate is, with respect to them, what milk is to infants. In reality, if one examines the nature of chocolate a little, with respect to the constitution of aged persons, it seems as though the one was made on purpose to remedy the defects of the other, and that it is truly the panacea of old age. The three associated beverages, cocoa, tea, and coffee, are known to the French as aromatic drinks. Each of these has its characteristic aroma. The fragrance and flavor are so marked that they cannot be imitated by any artificial products, although numerous attempts have been made in regard to all three. Hence the detection of adulteration is not a difficult matter. Designing persons, aware of the extreme difficulty of imitating these substances, have undertaken to employ lower grades, and, by manipulation, copy, as far as may be, the higher sorts. Everyone knows how readily tea, and coffee for that matter, will take up odors and flavors from substances placed near them. This is abundantly exemplified in the country grocery or general store, where the teas and coffees share in the pervasive fragrance of the cheese and kerosene. But perhaps it is not so widely understood that some of these very teas and coffees had been artificially flavored or corrected before they reached their destination in this country. Cacao lends itself very readily to such preliminary treatment. In a first-class article, the beans should be of the highest excellence. They should be carefully grown on the plantation, and there prepared with great skill, arriving in the factory in good condition. In the factory they should simply receive the mechanical treatment requisite to develop their high and attractive natural flavor and fragrance. They should be most carefully shelled after roasting, and finely ground without concealed additions. This is the process in all honest manufactories of the cacao products. Now, as a matter of fact, in the preparation of many of the cacao products on the market, a wholly different course has been pursued. Beans of poor quality are used because of their cheapness, and in some instances they are only imperfectly, if at all, shelled before grinding. Chemical treatment is relied on to correct in part the odor and taste of such inferior goods, and artificial flavors, other than the time-honored natural vanilla and the like, are added freely. The detection of such imposition is easy enough to the expert, but is difficult to the novice. Therefore the public is largely unable to discriminate between the good and the inferior, and it is perforce compelled to depend almost entirely on the character and reputation of the manufacturer. A distinguished London physician, in giving some hints concerning the proper preparation of cocoa, says, start with a pure cocoa of undoubted quality and excellence of manufacture, and which bears the name of a respectable firm. This point is important, for there are many cocoas on the market which have been doctored by the addition of alkali, starch, malt, cola, hops, etc. Baker's breakfast cocoa is absolutely pure, and, being ground to an extraordinary degree of fineness, is highly soluble. The analyst of the Massachusetts State Board of Health states in his recent valuable work on Food Inspection and Analysis that the treatment of cocoa with alkali, for the purpose of producing a more perfect emulsion, is objectionable, even if not considered as a form of adulteration. Cocoa thus treated is generally darker in color than the pure article. The legitimate means, he says, for making it as soluble as possible is to pulverize it very fine, so that particles remain in even suspension and form a smooth paste. That is the way Baker's cocoa is treated. It has received the grand prize, highest award ever given in this country, and altogether 52 highest awards in Europe and America. Choice Recipes by Miss Marla Parloa, specially prepared for Walter Baker and Company, Limited. Plain chocolate. For 6 people, use 1 quart of milk, 2 ounces of Walter Baker & Company's Premium No. 1 chocolate, 1 tablespoonful of cornstarch, 3 tablespoonfuls of sugar, and 2 tablespoonfuls of hot water. Mix the cornstarch with 1 gill of the milk. Put the remainder of the milk on to heat in the double boiler. When the milk comes to the boiling point, stir in the cornstarch and cook for 10 minutes. Have the chocolate cut in fine bits and put it in a small iron or graniteware pan. Add the sugar and water and place the pan over a hot fire. Stir constantly until the mixture is smooth and glossy. Add this to the hot milk and beat the mixture with a whisk until it is frothy. Or the chocolate may be poured back and forth from the boiler to a pitcher, holding high the vessel from which you pour. This will give a thick froth. Serve at once. If you prefer not to have the chocolate thick, omit the cornstarch. If condensed milk is used, substitute water for the milk named above, and add 3 tablespoons of condensed milk when the chocolate is added. Chocolate, Vienna style. Use 4 ounces of Walter Baker & Company's vanilla chocolate, 1 quart of milk, 3 tablespoons of hot water, and 1 tablespoonful of sugar. Cut the chocolate in fine bits. Put the milk on the stove in the double boiler, and when it has been heated to the boiling point, put the chocolate, sugar, and water in a small iron or graniteware pan, and stir over a hot fire until smooth and glossy. Stir this mixture into the hot milk, and beat well with a whisk. Serve at once, putting a tablespoonful of whipped cream in each cup, and then filling up with the chocolate. The plain chocolate may be used instead of the vanilla, but in that case use a teaspoonful of vanilla extract, and 3 generous tablespoonfuls of sugar instead of 1. Breakfast cocoa. Walter Baker & Company's breakfast cocoa is powdered so fine that it can be dissolved by pouring boiling water on it. For this reason it is often prepared at the table. A small teaspoonful of the powder is put in the cup with a teaspoonful of sugar. On this is poured 2/3 of a cup of boiling water, and milk or cream is added to suit the individual taste. This is very convenient, but cocoa is not nearly so good when prepared in this manner as when it is boiled. For 6 cupfuls of cocoa, use 2 tablespoonfuls of the powder, 2 tablespoonfuls of sugar, half a pint of boiling water, and 1.5 pints of milk. Put the milk on the stove in the double boiler. Put the cocoa and sugar in a saucepan, and gradually pour the hot water upon them, stirring all the time. Place the saucepan on the fire, and stir until the contents boil. Let this mixture boil for 5 minutes, then add the boiling milk, and serve. A gill of cream is a great addition to this cocoa. Scalded milk may be used in place of boiled milk, if preferred. For flavoring, a few grains of salt and half a teaspoonful of vanilla extract may be added. End of selections from Chocolate and Cocoa Recipes by Miss Maria Parloa, specially prepared for Walter Baker & Company, Limited.
Thomas Jefferson, First Inaugural Address, in Washington, D.C., Wednesday, March 4th, 1801. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Friends and fellow citizens, called upon to undertake the duties of the first executive office of our country, I avail myself of the presence of that portion of my fellow citizens which is here assembled to express my grateful thanks for the favor with which they have been pleased to look towards me, to declare a sincere consciousness that the task is above my talents, and that I approach it with those anxious and awful presentiments which the greatness of the charge and the weakness of my powers so justly inspire. A rising nation, spread over a wide and fruitful land, traversing all the seas with the rich productions of their industry, engaged in commerce with nations who feel power and forget right, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. When I contemplate these transcendent objects and see the honor, the happiness, and the hopes of this beloved country committed to the issue, and the auspices of this day, I shrink from the contemplation and humble myself before the magnitude of the undertaking. Utterly, indeed, should I despair did not the presence of many whom I here see remind me that in the other high authorities provided by our Constitution I shall find resources of wisdom, of virtue, and of zeal on which to rely under all difficulties. To you then, gentlemen, who are charged with the sovereign functions of legislation, and to those associated with you, I look with encouragement for that guidance and support which may enable us to steer with safety the vessel in which we are all embarked amidst the conflicting elements of a troubled world. During the contest of opinion through which we have passed, the animation of discussions and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers unused to think freely and to speak and to write what they think. But this being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law and unite in common efforts for the common good. All, too, will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that, having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the antagonizing spasms of infuriated man, seeking through blood and slaughter his long-lost liberty, it was not wonderful that the agitation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less than others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I know, indeed, that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may by possibility want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it the only one where every man at the call of law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that a man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. Let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and republican principles, our attachment to union and representative government. Kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of one quarter of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradations of the others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the thousandth and thousandth generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal right to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them, enlightened by a benign religion, professed indeed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man, acknowledging and adoring an overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness thereafter. With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people? Still one more thing, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. About to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you, it is proper you should understand what I deem the essential principles of our government, and consequently those which ought to shape its administration. I will compress them within the narrowest compass they will bear, stating the general principle, but not all its limitations. Equal and exact justice to all men, of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The support of the state governments in all their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. The preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor as the sheet anchor of our peace at home and safety abroad. A jealous care of the right of election by the people. A mild and safe corrective of abuses which are lopped by the sword of revolution where peaceable remedies are unprovided. Absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority, the vital principle of republics, from which is no appeal but to force, the vital principle and immediate parent of despotism. A well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war, till regulars may relieve them. The supremacy of the civil over the military authority. Economic in the public expense, that labor may be lightly burdened. The honest payment of our debts and sacred preservation of the public faith. Encouragement of agriculture and of commerce as its handmaid. The diffusion of information and arraignment of all abuses at the bar of public reason. Freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of person under protection of habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected. These principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. The wisdom of our sages and blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. They should be the creed of our political faith, the text of civic instruction, the touchstone by which to try the services of those who we trust. And should we wander from them in moments of error or of alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps and to regain the road which alone leads to peace, liberty, and safety. I repair then, fellow citizens, to the post you have assigned me. With experience enough in subordinate offices to have seen the difficulties of this greatest of all, I have learnt to expect that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect man to retire from this station with the reputation and the favor which bring him into it. Without pretensions to that high confidence you reposed in our first and greatest revolutionary character, whose preeminent services has entitled him to the first place in his country's love, and destined for him the fairest page in the volume of faithful history, I ask so much confidence only as may give firmness and effect to the legal administration of your affairs. I shall often go wrong through defect of judgment. When right, I shall often be thought wrong by those whose positions will not command a view of the whole ground. I ask your indulgence for my own errors, which will never be intentional, and your support against the errors of others, who may condemn what they would not if seen in all of its parts. The approbation implied by your suffrage is a great consolation to me for the past, and my future solicitude will be to retain the good opinion of those who have bestowed it in advance, to conciliate that of others by doing them all the good in my power, and to be instrumental to the happiness and freedom of all. Relying then on the patronage of your goodwill, I advance with obedience to the work, ready to retire from it whenever you become sensible how much better choice it is in your power to make. And may that infinite power, which rules the destinies of the universe, lead our counsels to what is best, and give them a favorable issue for your peace and prosperity. End Thomas Jefferson First Inaugural Address. Read by M.L. Cohen, MojoMove411.com, Cleveland, Ohio, September 2007.